This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
And this is another episode of Art of Dark Pod, artofdarkpod.com, Twitter at Art of Dark Pod. What else, Kevin? Patreon.com/artofdarkpod for those after
back.
dark. Yeah, we're back. I wasn't going to say anything. I wasn't going to jinx it, Kevin.
I've been in the woods for an entire month. I've been communing with the spirits of the forest, including little mushroom spirits.
That's good.
And they're going to use me as a vehicle to communicate certain truths about the nature of the universe, novelty.
Okay.
And we're gonna figure out where all your hair went, Brad.
That is a mystery that will not be solved today or any other day. Well, Kevin, first of all, it's good to see you, man.
Thanks, buddy. Yeah, we took a little sabbatical. What is the phrase that you use, Brad? You talk about this as like an effort pod.
An effort pod, yes.
Yeah. We don't simply come on and banter for 3-4 hours.
Right.
We prep these shows. That's why we don't have how to say this. We don't say, okay, every 2 weeks on this date, you're going to get a new episode. It's a little more erratic.
It is.
Because
we're a couple of erratic guys.
We don't know. Like it could take 4 weeks to research a subject. It could take 6 weeks. It could take 2 weeks. In any case, we do endeavor to be consistent. We do try to put out at least 2 core episodes a month. But today, in a very, very special day for Art of Darkness, this is our first doubleheader day where we're going to put out 2 core episodes in one single day. So this is a big deal for us.
Yeah. No, it's going to be big, and it's we're doing two subjects who are, one's an obvious candidate for Art of Darkness. One is maybe not so obvious, and that's the one I think we're doing today.
We're doing right now, you mean? We're doing them both today.
We're doing right now. As we're talking. We're doing them both today. But we're doing one later, and right now we're doing Terence McKenna. To do this, we're actually going to have a very, very special guest coming to help us out, someone near and dear to our hearts, a co-conspirator in the whole Art of Dark thing. And that is the artist, the brilliant artist behind all of our episode art,
Francis Bacon.
Right? No,
that's our second subject. He's dead. We have the great Pineal Colada.
Yes, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, thank you.
Yeah, and so this is going to be really cool. We've been kind of going back and forth about how we're going to approach this. She's got a lot of interesting insight, and we'll let her talk about that. But before we get too deep into it, we just wanted to say, sort of, once again, thank you, Pineal, for all the work you've done to give the Art of Darkness show the vibe that it has, the look that it has. Kevin and I are kind of responsible for how it sounds. You are responsible for how it looks. And so that's just really cool. It's really cool to have you on, and I think this is going to be a lot of fun.
Perfect. Thank you.
And anybody who likes the episode art, it's not like this is all she does. She's got an Etsy where what kind of stuff do you have on Etsy? You should explain it rather than me muddling through it.
Right. I have prints and little knick-knack type things. Everything's been painted in black light paint and usually glow in the dark, and then greeting cards, stuff like that.
Yeah.
A little bit of everything.
Yeah, it's cool. It's a very, very cool style, very cool look. So Okay, so we're gonna launch into it, but we have to start with our question. Kevin, we're talking about Terence McKenna. What do you know about Terence McKenna?
I'm going to rewind and say first, thanks to our Patreon subscribers.
Oh,
We
yeah.
love you. We adore you. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe. You get extra content every episode. We do another 20, 30 minutes after dark. We're also adding some other bonus stuff. That's at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Brad, can you tease? What are you going to talk about today? Well, I'll answer your
First you answer
question.
this question.
Yeah, I'll answer the question. Then you tease it. So what do I know about Terence McKenna? Okay, Terence is somebody I know. I think I know something about. He's right next to, he's like the Timothy Leary of mushrooms. And he came up with this theory of the stoned ape, this idea that we, like, language could have evolved because our biological ancestors started eating these hallucinogenic mushrooms and started tripping, and that's where language came from, and our brains evolved in a very particular way because of this intervention by the mushroom. He also came up with this really bonkers theory, time wave zero, and it had this idea of like increasing novelty, and it had something to do with what 2012 and the Mayan calendar. And he was a big devotee of DMT, and he was sort of like the arch, I guess, what's the word, like almost like the gospel of DMT according to Terence. You're gonna hit this stuff out of a bubble, you're gonna inhale, you're gonna do it 3-4 times, and then you're gonna punch through the veil and meet the machine elves. Which squares with my experience, in Minecraft. But yeah, and I've just eaten a heroic dose of mushrooms.
Oh boy, we got to get this show out.
So I'll be coming up. I'm kidding. I'm stone cold sober right now, but that's more or less what I know about Terence McKenna. I also know about his brother Dennis, who I think has some connections to the University of Minnesota here. But that's what I know, Brad. So I'm excited for this episode to learn more about the great man.
Yeah, that's all about true. I mean, obviously we're going to add more details to it, but yeah, that's that kind of who he was, I think. This is an interesting figure to do for us because Art of Darkness, we tend to focus on people who are conventionally thought of as artists. And Terence McKenna doesn't necessarily come up. That's not necessarily the first word that you use for him, right? He's not writing novels, he's not writing plays, he's not a filmmaker, he's not a musician. But I think we're going to see through this that there is a mile wide streak of the artist of some kind running through his life.
Yeah,
so
I mean, he's sort of like a creative, poetic, philosophical, shamanistic freak culture.
Right.
He's not an artist in the sense that, let's say, Francis Bacon, who we're going to cover next, is, right? He didn't sit down to paint per se, but he was certainly a storyteller.
Yes.
And I do think it's worth noting, and McKenna, of course, would have been of Irish descent, and so was Leary. So there's that weird kind of Irish gift of gab and linguistic sort of
and also a predilection towards the fairy and elfish. So anyway, we're going to get to that.
Indeed.
Right?
Let's go.
So Terence McKenna, as we've kind of talked about, goes by a bunch of labels: freak, ethnobotanist, expert in shamanism, butterfly collector, an advocate for drugs, a hippie, a quote unquote consultant, which we'll talk about, which I think is pretty interesting. Also a writer, has a number of books and essays. He called himself at certain times a gadfly, a cultural commentator, a philosopher. Other people sometimes thought of him as a doomsday prophet. And he is, I think this has come to be appreciated even more so lately, a poet of a sort in the sort of the bardic tradition of the kind of roving storytelling poet, right? So this is the guy we're going to talk about. So I want to get let's talk about a couple things about him, and then we're going to talk about his biggest theory, and I think that's going to help us understand what his whole life was about. So when he died, there was he had a New York Times obituary, which for some reason kind of surprised me. I had always thought he was a little more fringe than that, but I guess it makes perfect sense. Now, at this time, I want to give you kind of two an outsider opinion, somebody who doesn't like Terrence, right? What they thought of him. This was from at the time of his death. This was from the president or the vice president of something called the Phoenix House of New York, which is a drug treatment center. She would say about him, quote, Terrence says that the psilocybin mushroom is a megaphone used by an alien intergalactic other to communicate with mankind. Surely this is enough for us to wonder if taking LSD has done something to his mental faculties. All right, so there are people in the straight world, and I don't mean in sexual orientation. People in the straight world thought he was insane in some way, oftentimes, right? But here's Terrence talking about himself and his approach. Okay, this is a quote on him, I believe, in 1994. So this was well into his career. He is the Terence McKenna that people know about at this point. People, quote, this is from Terrence, quote, people are confused sometimes by exactly who and what I am. That's because in my personality, which is a humbler word than method, two things are united, which are usually not found co-present. My techniques are all shamanic and involve perturbing the senses and dissolving ordinary states of mind through psychedelics. So my techniques are shamanic, but my method is rational and analytical. So I use shamanic techniques to go into shamanic places and then attempt to study them scientifically, saying, what is this? How does it work? What is it made of? How do its parts relate to each other? What is its inner dynamic? This, apparently, though it seems fairly obvious to me, is a fairly radical union of techniques. Scientists don't explore psychedelics because somehow the scientific mind must not be besmirched by being studied. But how can you study psychedelics without taking them? I am not part of the New Age in my own mind, typified by an incredible credulity and an utter immunity to cognitive dissonance. I mean, you can believe in the New Age that reality is ruled from the Pleiades, and you can believe that L. Ron Hubbard is right. The number of contradictions that the New Age can contain is immense. But what I do is I probe weirdness, but rationally. Most people attracted to weirdness want to convert and believe it and exalt it. I don't want to believe anything. I hate ideology, all ideology, because ideologies are a lesser resolution of the dilemma than we are capable of. The higher resolution lies in real feeling and real community. Ideology has poisoned these last 1,000 years. All of these ideologies have ultimately done more bad than good. Marxism and even Christianity, Freudianism. The correct method, I think, is the phenomenological approach. Collect data, find patterns, draw conclusions, test them back against the original data. Most people who advocate that approach somehow come down. They crash. They find it reduces and insults everything. But I have found real weirdness. The world is very, very, very strange. When we asked the mushroom, and he's talking about he and his brother and his friends, when we asked the mushroom why it had brought its teaching to us, it told me that it was because we didn't believe in anything. Okay, so that's Terrence describing himself, right?
Yeah,
that's him and his approach and his idea,
sure.
his greater perspective, not in the nuances of shamanism and what the mushrooms mean and all of that, but in a much more exterior level. What does Terrence think he's about? And I just really like that issue. I like him pushing back against being part of the New Age without entirely dismissing every aspect of it, right? I like him pushing back on all the ideologies. I think this is really interesting. He would describe himself often as an anarchist, but a real anarchist, So now, okay, what that kind of guy, right? If he is rationally going into these shamanic scenarios and analyzing them and trying to come up with data and testing these theories, what did he come up with? Well, the biggest thing he quote unquote came up with, or say brought back and then refined and distilled, is his theory that he kind of wrestled with his whole life, or at least half of his life, which has come to be known as the time wave. And Pineal, this is where I'm going to kind of throw it to you. Can you tell us, okay, we say the time wave. What does this mean? What is the time wave?
Well, at some point, he got a hold of the I Ching.
Right, which we all do, as you do from time to time.
He found that by breaking, I forget, well, it's a codified nature of time's flow. So I don't have the exact math of how he was breaking down each of the numbers that he had. But anyway, that was me trying to explain
So
the math part
yeah,
of
I
it.
think it's like something to do. There's like 64. So there's 64
Right.
hexagrams in the I Ching. And then it's like he came to understand that pattern 64 is a pattern that's inherent in DNA as well. And then he started to seem like he was understanding that pattern showed up in history in some
Right.
way.
Yeah. And he
Yeah.
was trying to show that, well, as time and novelty goes on, um, increases, complexity increases too, but like it would peak like a time wave. Some of the time wave, if you follow the graph of it, it would peak in ancient Egypt
Mhm.
and then dip during the burning of the Library of Alexandria.
Mhm.
And then, yeah, peak back up, I guess, in the 60s with him in Peru. And
Mhm.
a lot of it was just, um, yeah, people though picking what is novelty, what has the most novelty of, I don't know, the year, the month,
Yeah,
the date.
that's what was kind of unusual. That was kind of weird about it when you listen to it. It's like, well, okay, he would pick these events. Like one of the things that he thought was important was the dropping of the atom bomb on Japan, and that is, I mean, that is a novel event that never happened before. But like, as Dennis, his brother, would say, it was like, well, was the dropping it what was unusual, or was it like a year before when they came up with it and did like the first testing? Like, when exactly is this novelty point, right? And then how do you decide what else is novel? It's kind of it's a hard thing. It's a qualitative thing. So to say like that's the peak novelty, and then some other thing doesn't count, it's kind of weird.
All right. He
Yeah.
said he was trying to redeem history by making it make sense and like showing that it obeyed certain laws, I guess, which
Yeah.
is tricky.
I just read that he attended Berkeley, and that is the least surprising thing that I'm going to read today.
Oh, we're gonna get to it. Yeah. So he attended Berkeley. Yeah. So he has this idea. He has this idea of that history has a pattern. That there's a pattern to all of this. And it goes down into like evolution itself has a kind of a telos, right? It has an endpoint that it's trying to get to, and he would refine this idea over many years, and it's kind of the big thing that he struggled with, right? And we're going to get into, I think, some reasons why that was it was so important for him to figure out, and why it was this sort of it was sort of his like intellectual Moby Dick in a way, right? Like this thing that he was trying to nail down for years and years and years and really try to understand. And it comes up throughout his biography too. So we might as well get into it because Kevin, you talked about Berkeley. Let's kind of talk about where Terence McKenna begins, because we all know he now ends as this sort of disembodied voice on the internet, that there are hours and hours and hours and literally like 500 hours of Terence. I don't even know how many hours.
Of course, right.
Terence McKenna
And once
talking.
you've heard his voice one time,
yeah,
it cuts through your brain. You're never going to forget Terence McKenna's
Mhm.
voice. Nobody
It's-
quite sounds like him. He has just such a unique style.
Mhm.
And he's right on the edge of like being that guy who corners you in the bar and won't shut up. But
Right.
then you
Right.
quickly discover he's one of the most interesting, educated,
Yeah.
unique people you'll ever meet.
Yeah, he is sort of one of those guys who like he could be. I could imagine there's versions of him all over the country who are not as intelligent or well read as him, who like can do this thing that they try to take over a conversation, right? But like you wanted him to take over the conversation, right? It's like nobody in the room is going to be as interesting to hear talk as he is, right? Super charismatic in a very particular way. So anyway, Terence is born. We'll go back to the beginning. Terence is born November 16th, 1946, Double Scorpio, by the way. I'm gonna start doing this every time we do an episode, just out of curiosity, see what their zodiac sign is. He grew up as the older brother in this town, Paonia, Colorado, little town in the western slope. Excuse me, about halfway between Denver and Moab, Utah. Even today, only about 1,500 people live in Paonia, small town. He said they tried to name it peony, but they didn't know how to spell peony. Like it's like very, which I think might have been a joke, but nonetheless, very small town. Kind of a cow town, quasi mountainous town. He on one side, on his mother's side, they come from Italy. So his grandmother comes from Salerno, Italy. And there's a whole backstory of interesting sort of intrigue on the Italian side. But I don't know how much we're going to go into that necessarily. One where I think it starts to get interesting is Terence's father is born Leadville, Colorado, 1915, and he comes from these Irish Catholic immigrant miners who came over during the potato famine, right, as so many people did. And two of Terence's father's aunts became Catholic nuns. And one of these nuns would become something of an expert in chemistry, right? So I just think this is a nun who is an expert in chemistry seems to me like it makes perfect sense to be the great aunt of the McKenna boys.
Very much.
Terence and her brother, right?
That sounds perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. So Terence's father, there's a little bit of Terence, and we're going to be referring to Dennis McKenna occasionally because Dennis McKenna, Terence's brother, still alive, as a respectable scientist working in the same, at least in an adjacent terrain to the kinds of things Terence was talking about, though he's a sort of hard scientist, respectable guy. A lot of this biographical information actually comes from Dennis's 2012 biography. It's sort of like a dual biography. It's sort of an biography called The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, which is the biography of both Dennis and Terence. And it makes sense because their lives intertwine very intensely, even maybe more so than most brothers do. So their father, Joe McKenna, he's a sort of an adventurous guy. He eventually does settle down, but he had like a pilot's license. He was a bit of a BS artist himself. He liked to tell a tall tale. Shortly after they get married to Terence's mother, he moves to Oakland, California, right? So he tries to get out of Colorado and go to California. He enlists for World War II, right? He's born in 1915, so he's right at that right age. He doesn't end up getting he does get deployed. He gets deployed and is a top gunner and an engineer on a B-17 bomber flying in Europe, which is interesting because Terence never mentions this. He talks about like World War II kind of looms large because it's part of this time wave thing. And Terence is born right at the tail end of it, 1946, but he never sort of mentions this. He's kind of light on biographical detail for all of the hundreds of hours in which he's talking. Let's see. During the war, Hattie, which would be his Hattie is his so Hattie is his mom. So during the war she would work for Henry Kaiser of Kaiser Steel, which again he's a steel baron. So Terence's mother worked for a steel baron for a time, which I think is also interesting. So he's sort of Terence is from this cow town, but there is also these kind of tendrils of the larger world definitely entering into his life. Now, 1946, by the time Terence comes around, Joe, his father, has kind of settled in. He's working as a sales rep for an electrical supply company, and he's touring around Western Colorado and Northern New Mexico. He's very often gone all the whole work week while Terence and Dennis are growing up, which has its implications, as you might imagine. But here is Terence. We'll have Terence described by his brother Dennis. Terence as a child. They would refer to him as Terrible Terry because he was very temperamental. He was difficult to deal with, and he terrorized Dennis, like physically, emotionally, psychologically bullied him, tortured him. I don't know how much he beat him up necessarily, but like would tell him these horrifying stories that made Dennis scared of going to sleep at night and all kinds of things like this, right? Dennis relates it as being quite a difficult childhood having Terence as his older brother. Terence is about three or four. Sorry, Terence is, I think, 5 years older than Dennis. And there's a story that happens right before Dennis is born that this is going to be like our first sort of moment of darkness, because we are going to find the darkness in this guy's life. I think it's worth, some of the stuff's worth talking about. It's interesting anyway. So Terence is like 4 years old, right? He's playing in a sandbox with like a neighborhood friend, a boy from the neighborhood. And they're playing in a sandbox kind of by themselves, left to themselves. And for whatever reason, Terence and this little boy start playing with each other's genitals and apparently with each other's fecal matter. Okay. They're 3 and 4 years old, right? They're tiny little kids. They've just been left on their own. Okay. Not a big deal, really, right?
Right.
In and of itself, if you don't pay any attention to it, not a big deal. But Joe, the dad, finds them in this state, right? Comes across the two boys playing with each other's testicles and playing with each other's poop, and like spanks, beats and yells at Terence, kind of loses it on Terence, right? And here's a quote from Dennis about the impact of this. Quote, "That was it," Terence said when he told me the story. "That was it between us, between Terence's father and he. He slammed an emotional door on our father that was never to be reopened, or so I believe. In that one instant, he resolved to protect himself at any cost, to never show vulnerability, and to put his own self-interests front and center at all times. It would seem that, in his own mind, his mistreatment justified his extreme hostility over the years toward our parents, especially our father, and also toward me. As Terence matured, he got better at relationships, but they were never easy for him. He told me this story with great vehemence and as if it had happened yesterday. I am left wondering if this experience had resulted in a loss of some essential willingness to trust in others. The story explained my experience of an emotional firewall that I often encountered at the core of our relationship, and what I could perceive of his relationship with others. As for me, he eventually discovered that I wasn't just a younger, weaker brother to torture. He did express his love for me, but only after years of abuse." Right? So this had some effect. Now, Joe, Terence's father, doesn't have, there's not, a long, tawdry list of abusive scenarios from their father. There's really just this one. But apparently it was, Dennis perceived it anyway, as enough to have caused a compensatory kind of psychological response in Terence.
Sure, yeah. That's pretty heavy. I mean, the fact that they even remembered it and that it was recounted means that it must have meant something.
Right.
Yeah. A lot of people would just get past it or would repress it.
Yeah. And especially being that young, 3 or 4 years old, and you remember it and you're like, I specifically made a decision then, right? Like at 3, you made a decision that you were gonna
right. Yeah, precocious.
Right. So
time wave toddler.
Right. That's very well put, because we're going to come up to some stuff about that exact kind of thing. Here's one thing that I also found very interesting. One thing that Terence would say to Dennis from time to time, as they're getting older, but they're still in this thing where he's older, Terence's older brother kind of torturing him. He would say to Dennis, "Never oppose my will. Never, ever oppose my will." Right. So it was very important for Terence to have control over Dennis when they were younger. And I'm not
How many years apart were they?
About 5.
5. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, about 5, 4 or 5. And this isn't to say that this is like Terence's whole. I don't want to project this as Terence's attitude throughout his whole life, but this is clearly at the core of this relationship that would be one of the most important relationships of his life with his brother Dennis.
Okay, I got to stop you.
Yeah.
What are we talking about for Patreon subscribers on the After Dark episode? Patreon.com/ArtOfDarkPod. Support the show.
We are going to talk about the question. We're going to go over what evidence is available and arguments have been made about whether or not Terence was an intelligence asset.
Woo!
So I'm not going to give you what my opinion is on it yet, but there is some things to point at for sure. Okay.
There almost always is.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing. You find this out. It's like, wait, everybody works for the CIA? Yes, pretty much, unwittingly or not. Yeah.
Yeah, just for the record, we stan the CIA. We are CIA respecters.
They have the CIA has an official podcast now. I'm trying to get us on there as guests. So
all right, they'd call it the grassy knoll.
Yeah.
I
Okay,
have my own take on the CIA thing as well.
Oh, do you? Okay, good.
Yeah,
we will talk about it. This is
okay,
excellent.
good.
I love it.
On the After Dark episode, every episode gets a bonus for Patreon. We put the work in, support the show. It starts at $3 a month. Throw us $3, throw us $6, throw us $10. We put in a lot of work for every episode. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so Terence, just a couple things about his youth before we get him to Berkeley, as Kevin said. He is really, and he would talk about this later in life, he always considered himself an edge runner. So when he was a kid, and what that means is he was always trying to find the edge of things. This is how he found psychedelics. This is how he got to every little nook and cranny of the world and the mind and of science and of literature that he ever did, was this attitude of kind of probing curiosity. And so when he was a kid, that meant fossils, it meant insect collection, it meant rocketry, it meant, and then, science fiction, and then, which he described as the real gateway drug, science fiction. And from there, he found his way into drugs, right? So, you kind of wonder how a kid from a little town in 1950s, middle of nowhere, Colorado, ends up getting into drugs. The first thing was that famous Life magazine article with Gordon Wasson discovering mushrooms. And there's a story of Terence like chasing his mom around the house being like, what is this? What does this mean? Pointing at that Life magazine article that's become kind of this famous thing. And for us to understand what that was like, we didn't have this huge stigma about psychedelics in the 1950s when that famous Life magazine came out, because nobody was doing psychedelics in 1958. Right. It wasn't like, oh, well, that kid down the street, he blew his mind, he burned his mind out on acid, whatever.
You had Artaud maybe had been to Mexico.
It was very little stuff.
It had not crossed over yet.
Especially in the public.
The 3-letter agencies had not yet flipped the switch to get the kids hooked on LSD and shrooms and things yet. Right.
So Terence goes through this period. He begs and pleads with his parents to let him move to California for the last 2 years of high school. And he is so persistent about it. So this is the thing. And this is Kevin, something that Terence has in common, I think, with a number of other subjects we've covered on the show. Terence ends up getting what he wants. And not in a spoiled brat kind of way, in a like persistent, strategic, sometimes manipulative way. He gets what he wants. And so he does end up going to California for junior year of high school. He goes and he stays with an aunt and an uncle. This does not go well because he ends up losing his virginity to the mother of a friend. Ooh. It causes a whole scene. He goes back to Colorado. It's possible this woman even came to Colorado and like tried to like quote unquote rescue him from his parents again. But the story is very muddled in like McKenna family lore. So it's
wow, fun. Yeah. Well, these are we're starting to get into some of the leitmotifs of our show here, aren't we? We've got some young man with serious scatological daddy issues who ends up having an indomitable will, which is something that many of our subjects seem to have. They get their way, precocious, and then sexually kind of not sexually abnormal.
Within one standard deviation of normal, but maybe a little unusual in terms of just the story.
True. Losing your virginity to your friend's mom is that's a little far out in the 50s, I would say.
I would in the 50s.
It's a little far out now, I think.
This would have been like 62, but
he doesn't strike me. Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, well, okay. Yeah. Well, the Beatles were around the corner. Right. He not that has anything to do with sleeping with MILFs.
Right.
I want to hold your mom's hand. But this is good because you're painting a picture of this oddball. He doesn't strike me as somebody who went to prom with Nancy down the street,
No,
right?
no. And his
Yeah,
reputation, I mean, part of the reason I think he got out of Paonia is not only because he was constantly seeking novelty, and you run out of novelty in Paonia, Colorado pretty quickly if you're aggressive about it. Another thing was that he was not particularly well liked among the other, he probably went to a high school of 100 people or whatever. He was not particularly well liked. He does claim that he kind of developed his gift of gab by talking himself out of situations as like an adolescent, right? Just like, we're going to beat you up, Terry. And he would just like rail off some weird story and it would be kind of fun, like just being able to kind of push back on physical aggression through conversation. The other thing too is this is for people who aren't familiar with Terence McKenna, he doesn't present in the most what we would think of as like a stereotypically masculine manner, right? He's kind of thin, he's very like intellectual, he's very, he's very verbose. What's that?
Elfish.
He is elfish. He's kind of an elf. He's
kind of a nerd's nerd if
really
you look
is.
at him. And
yeah.
I say that's not a pejorative.
No, I have nothing but I have a lot of respect for him. But yeah, this is how he presents himself. Now he's in Paonia, Colorado, where the rite of passage is, Terry, you're gonna have to go out and shoot an elk. And it's just not his bag. This is not, he kind of doesn't belong there in a lot of ways. So this makes sense that he's trying to go to California. Now, after that first year in California, where he sleeps with the friend's mom, he comes back and then he manages to finagle his way to go stay with somebody else for senior year. He ends up going to Antelope Valley High School in Lancaster, California for his senior year. The only reason I bring this up is because Frank Zappa and the Captain Beefheart guy graduated from that high school 5 years before. So Terence McKenna, though not at the same time, went to the same high school as Frank Zappa, which I just think is just an interesting historical.
That feels right.
Yeah,
that feels right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that squares.
Right. So okay, so Berkeley. He ends up in Berkeley. He ends up in Berkeley in 1965, which is, this is the height of things in a way, or at least the beginning of the height of things, of kind of California counterculture coming out of the Bay Area mid to the late 60s. I had to hear in a note, a very uninteresting and unremarkable time and place, right? It's like so much came out of it. The list of other people who were in that sort of those zip codes at that same time just goes on and on and on and on and on. But here's where we get into the first thing that we may or may not talk about it much in the After Dark, but here's where a first little asterisk goes: intelligence asset. Terence McKenna was part of something called the Experimental College at Berkeley. So within Berkeley, this guy, Joseph Tussman, started something called the Experimental College, that was a sort of a short-lived program that Terence and 150 other freshmen were brought in to see if it would work. You didn't really have traditional class structures. You read intensely, and most of the coursework was just you having group conversations.
Boy, that sounds a little bit like what they did to Uncle Ted. A little, maybe a little different. Well, I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that everything is MK Ultra.
So no. Yeah. Well, Kevin, do you know, and Pineal, you may know this, do you know Ted Kaczynski's whereabouts in 1967?
Was he at Harvard at the time?
He was at Berkeley at the time.
Berkeley. Wait, is Uncle Ted still alive, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, he's not,
sure.
You can't like go hang out with him, but.
No, right, but
we can't have him on as a guest.
We can't do. Yeah. I want Teddy K to come on and do a darkroom episode about Virginia Woolf.
He'd probably have some things to say.
Yeah, I think he would. Okay. Well, that's very. So he was at Berkeley too. Was he part of this experimental?
Well, no. So Ted came to Berkeley as a lecturer.
Okay.
So I don't know Ted's birthdays. I don't think.
Yeah, he was in a program like that where they made him write down all of his kind of a journal thing, and he'd read it back to the class, the certain select people at Berkeley, and then they'd make fun of you and like read it back to you and try to like hit you and just.
Wait, are you talking about Ted or are you talking about
Kaczynski?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that happened at Harvard.
Oh, was it
to be
Harvard?
It
Yeah,
might
no,
have
Yeah, I'm
been.
pretty sure it
Yeah.
was at
Yeah, it was East
Harvard.
Coast,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. They kind of tortured him a little bit at Harvard, but not to derail. I just think that's interesting. When they
It's
tap
relevant.
you on, yeah, when they tap you on the shoulder and you're a freshman or you're new anywhere, and they say, "Hey, we've got an experimental program. Do you want to sign up?" The
Right.
answer is always like, should you do heroin? The answer is
Yeah.
always no.
Oh, I would do. Oh, dude, if I was a freshman, they're like, "Do you want to go to this experimental college?" I'd be like, "Yes, yes, I do." Because
Okay.
you got to think. There's some ego involved in that too.
Hmm.
Somebody decided that Terrence was a good candidate for this,
Fair
right?
enough.
Right. Somebody said,
Okay.
"Hey, this guy's got something. Who knows
Hmm.
what it was?" He was very
Okay.
well read at this time already. He's an
Hmm.
obsessive reader.
Okay.
So and I'm sure he made something of an impression on that class as well, as you could imagine, right? It's just smoke weed all day and come to class and talk about books. It's like, it's Terrence. It's definitely perfectly fit for Terrence, I think, in a lot of ways.
He's coming
Um,
into his own here in
yeah,
California.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, there are, and here's another, here's the kind of a thing that develops. So he's in he's going to Berkeley as these 2 years come on. He actually starts to develop a little bit of a crowd coming over to his place and listening to him talk, like already. I mean, he's not getting paid for it. This isn't him going to Esalen Institute or anything later, but he's getting a reputation as being like, let's go hear what Terrence has to say. And you and your buddies would go over to Terence McKenna's flat and smoke some weed, put on a record, and Terrence would talk for 3.5 hours. And this is when he's like 18, 19 years old. So I think that's interesting. He's there's no sense in his mind that this is a career or anything. This is just what he likes to
He
do.
was almost doing like little salons, and
Mm-hmm.
at the risk of being a little on the nose here,
Mm-hmm.
thank goodness there weren't podcasts at that time.
Right,
Uh,
right,
no,
right.
or maybe it's a pity that there weren't, but who knows? Yeah, I mean, he
Yeah.
he seems like somebody, and we'll get to this at the end of the show on our final question. But he does seem like somebody, but like, wow, if he had a podcast, holy moly, look out!
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and now a big credit to his ability to do this. And this is, the more I read about him, the more I came to understand him, the more this made sense to me, is the fact that cannabis has the opposite effect on him than it has on most people. For most people, smoking pot doesn't make them, it may even make you talkative, but it doesn't make you more coherent, right? It doesn't spin you up into this like extroverted ability to just rap. And for Terrence, it had that effect. It allowed him to talk for hours with energy, to make lateral connections between things that maybe not have been connected. He was made him able to think out loud, but also in a very articulated way. This was sort of his magic weapon. And now some of these ideas that he comes up with out of this sound a little ridiculous to us, maybe. But there's also always more thought went into him than initially thought. And maybe this is a good time we can talk about the stoned ape theory, because this is another thing that he's sort of known for, the quote unquote stoned ape theory. And Pineal, maybe you can give us like broad brushstrokes. What is the stoned ape theory? What does that
Ah,
mean?
just a theory of possibly back in the day when everything was perfect for us. We were walking around eating mushrooms. Um, yeah, and then eventually we follow the mushrooms, follow the cattle, um, follow the food.
Mhm.
Your brain and yeah, linguistics begin to emerge. They have a better tribal sense of everything. Um, they're breeding more. They're hunting better. Yeah, 100,000 years ago,
Yeah.
just stoned ape.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of like, I think it's easy when you don't dig into it. It's like Terrence is saying that people ate shrooms and all of a sudden they became human beings. And he actually like he entangled it with like a lot of different things. The language was part of it, but that was only really part of it. Like, and he would link it to things like there are studies that show at like low doses you have greater visual acuity, like you can
Oh, without a
literally see
doubt.
better, right? So
Yeah,
of course
colors are
there's
brighter. Yeah.
Yeah. So of course there's an evolutionary advantage to that. How could there not be? Right.
Mm.
And then also like a little bit more and you become really horny. Well, that's got an evolutionary advantage too, right? Like he would describe all of these effects as having greater and greater evolutionary advantages. And then of course, yeah, at some point it does like kind of flow over into linguistic capacity and
And it
things like
stands
that as
to
well.
reason too. You would build rituals around it. There would be the
Mhm.
guy who would maybe take more than the other guys,
Right,
and
right,
that would
right,
be he would start to have a certain role in the community. Maybe he wasn't the best hunter, but
right,
he could take the most mushrooms, and then
right,
suddenly he's recording a podcast, or he's telling stories for 10 hours while everybody else eats the meat, and he's
right,
etc. Or she
right.
or she or
Yeah,
both.
yeah, or both.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they're the freaky couple that lives at the edge of the camp.
yeah, yeah. And so I think the theory gets a lot of grief because it sounds when you don't dig into it too deeply, it sounds a little ridiculous. But like these mushrooms are out there, and their effect on you is pretty dramatic. So to think that they don't have some role to play, to me seems giving it a little bit short shrift. Now, is it this like without mushrooms you wouldn't have human civilization? That seems maybe a little grandiose. I don't know, but the interesting thing about it in terms of Terence is how he pulled this together. He was so familiar with so many different scientific, cultural, historical, and pharmacological realities that he was able to kind of pull all this together and go, hey, wait a minute, like this actually mushrooms, you can fit mushrooms into slots in all of these different disciplines, and it all kind of makes sense. And that's the sort of thing he was so good at thinking through. Even if
He's a
ultimately it becomes an unfalsifiable theory, it's still interesting.
he kind of had a pre-internet hyperlink brain and was very syncretic
Mm-hmm.
and put almost like that Hesse novel, The Glass Bead Game,
Yeah, yeah,
somehow,
yeah,
where
yeah. I think that's well put.
we take
And
X, we take Y, we take Z, and we come up with something brand new.
yeah, I think that's really well put. And in stoned ape theory in particular is a good example of um how I think cannabis was something of a superpower for Terrence. Whereas it might not be that, it's different for everybody, right? But I think for Terrence, he was intelligent and articulate enough. I mean, whatever you think of him, we're talking about somebody whose verbal IQ is through the roof, right? I don't think anybody can deny that. Um, even if you think he's a lunatic, he's clearly some kind of verbal freak.
Yeah, historically, the Irish maybe got a raw deal. Didn't have much.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
was a thread going around on the Bird website last night. The guy eventually deleted it because he was getting absolutely bodied in the comments.
He
We
was.
are at Art of Dark Pod. Yeah, this economist from India asked why Ireland wasn't as developed and rich as, say, England. Like,
In the
why did the
19th
industrial
century
yeah, in the
particular.
19th
Yeah,
century, why didn't
yeah,
Ireland match England? And he
yeah.
just got mangled. Like, people could not even believe it. And suddenly you're seeing names like O'Shaughnessy and
Right.
Kelly,
Just coming out of the woodwork.
O'Connor, and just everybody just piling on. I didn't know whether he was trolling or not.
I
Uh,
thought, well, yeah, not to get into it. I thought he was trying to play a little game personally, but who
yeah,
knows?
but then he deleted it. So
Yeah,
who knows? Very, very
yeah.
strange. But we are the Irish question, the IQ, if you will will did I just come up with that?
I think so.
We'll figure heavily on our next episode, which is going to come hot on the heels of this
Yeah.
one, re Francis Bacon. But all I don't want to derail you, Brad. But yes, the Irish do have a certain degree of verbal and linguistic acumen,
Some too. There's
which
a tendency.
is
Yeah.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
so there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's clearly an arch example of that. I mean, you talked about Tim Leary and this isn't a Tim Leary episode. I think if you give Tim Leary's best talk plus public talk, it doesn't hold a candle to Terence McKenna's best talk, just in terms of variety of ideas and weirdness and interestingness. And I think Terence McKenna as a speaker is a far more interesting person personally. But we're going to talk about Tim Leary at some point on this show because That dude sent a shockwave through American culture that very few other people have, maybe nobody else has done. So, but he's definitely in that tradition. So, anyway, talking back Terence McKenna's life, 2 years at experimental college end, 1967. He doesn't have a degree yet, but the experimental college thing was experimental, so it was only 2 years. He decides to hit the hippie trail. Now, before he hits the hippie trail, something happens. He gets his first hit of DMT in 1967. It's given to him by an unnamed person from the Stanford Research Institute.
Oh,
so nothing fishy there.
yeah.
And then he hits the hippie trail. What do you guys know about the hippie trail? Does that mean anything to you guys?
Not to me personally.
Not a thing, but I can smell it.
I know it smells crazy.
It smells like body odor, patchouli, weed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A little bit of all those things. Yeah. Is it a term you've heard before, Kevin?
Believe it or not, no.
No. Okay. So
Yeah.
so the hippie trail was kind of a big deal. It's something that a lot of people will win on. It's a sort of an alternative tourist route through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, India, and into Nepal. Started in the mid 50s, went into the late 70s, right? So lots and lots and lots of people went on this. First beatniks.
Is this like Led Zeppelin, Kashmir, that kind of vibe where they all went east, like the Beatles ended up there? And okay, all right.
I think the Beatles did like a tour, like a very tourist version of this, but like lots of people. And if you
this is like that period where your father gives you 5% of your inheritance as an advance, and you can go live in France for 5 years on it somehow.
So instead what you do is you go hike, you go on this trail, and at the time there were like you would basically be traveling with other Westerners, and you would stop in towns and it'd be little hotels and hostels and things like that.
I'm sure the locals
route.
love that. I'm sure they just
love
that.
Money.
Yeah, hey, you're getting those greenbacks. Yeah,
it's money. Yeah. It's money. So in memoirs from like the 60s are replete with these hippie trail stories, right? Like thousands of people did this thing. It's not that but eventually it did kind of come to a close. Mostly it started closing down when Nepal, under pressure from the United States, outlawed cannabis entirely, because for a while Nepal was like the best place in the world to get hash. It's still
these kids and their devil weed.
Yeah. It still kind of is, but like it's not legal anymore, but for a while there you could just like go and like you just walk into a town and you'd have hash within minutes, right? And then of course there was a revolution in Afghanistan and a revolution in Iran, and all the countries along this route became a little tumultuous, and so the hippie trail kind of just closed down. But Terence hit the hippie trail pretty hard. He ends up in the Seychelles Islands. And the reason he ends up in the Seychelles is he was smuggling hash home. Terence McKenna was smuggling hash home, lots of hash.
Nice.
And
we do a little crime. We do a little crime.
Yeah.
I say, this is a true crime podcast. There has not been one artist we've done who hasn't committed at some point in their life or their death a crime.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me give you a little bit of a story of Terence talking about smuggling hash. Quote, I had a phase in my life when I used to smuggle hashish out of India. And I used to go to the Crawford Market in Bombay with kilos of gold strapped to my body. The Crawford Market sea is a labyrinth. I would, after a while, after leaving my taxi, I would come to a child whom I was supposed to meet, who would lead me by the hand through this labyrinth of streets to this Muslim gangster called the Baby Elephant. This huge guy draped in gold with his lieutenants around him. And they were always very happy to see me because we were going to do business. They were very helpful. And yet this was a criminal enterprise. I never fully trusted them. We also had to smoke tremendous amounts of hash while we were dealing. But you were also perfectly aware that they could kill you at any moment and there would be no consequences because they had all of Bombay paid off. So it was this very ambiguous thing. The general, and then he relates this he's talking about DMT when he tells this story, but the general mythology of elves is very much like this thing in Bombay. So you see, elves respect intelligence. The way they relate to intelligence is to set you riddles. They're all about language. If you're stupid, they'll put you to sleep for 100 years, But if you can solve their riddle in return, then they think you're a fine fellow and let you crawl back to the pub. So I like this story because it tells us in pretty succinct terms about his dealings with hash, but it also tells us what Terence understands to be important as a human being surviving. He thinks he might be right that like wit can get you through a lot, right? You can survive if you can dish it out, if you can talk, if you can figure things out on the fly, you'll be all right. And that's true in experimental college at Tussman. That's true talking to a gangster in India who you're about to make a hash deal with, and it's true when you're talking to the self-transforming machine elves in hyperspace, right? It's true.
Sales guys make the most money. If you're a good sales guy, you can do anything.
Yeah.
For real.
So I think Terence had that experience. I think he kind of believed that. Now, the hippie trail thing, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about this more later. He's smuggling hash back home and it gets busted stateside. His brother and some of his brother's friends are sort of on the receiving end of these shipments. And one of these shipments gets caught. Dennis almost does some jail time, but it never really pans out because like it's not technically, Dennis was never really in receipt of it. It was one of these friends, and it's all a little ambiguous exactly how it went down. But ultimately, they officially, the United States government or a local police force at least, and probably the FBI, had Terence's name as a international hash smuggler. And because of this, Terence was afraid to come back to the United States for a number of years. Part of this time he spent in the Seychelles writing his first book, which he did in a very interesting method. What he did was he planted some cannabis, and he decided he was going to write this book the entire time the cannabis was growing. And then when it was finished growing, he would be done with the book and he would smoke a bunch of weed. He did do that. When the book was finished, he smoked a bunch of weed that he had grown and decided the book was totally garbage. So he ends up rewriting it and traveling around. There's another period where he goes to Nepal and this might be a little bit earlier, and he decides he gets very interested in the sort of pre-Buddhist, I guess, indigenous religion of Tibet, which is called Bon. And Bon, all the folklore and aesthetics of Bon are what play into Tibetan Buddhism. So a lot of that Tibetan Buddhist art, the angry Buddhas and stuff, a lot of that aesthetically comes from Bon, which is not a Buddhist religion.
Interesting.
Right. Terence was convinced that he had picked up the trail, the scent of the use of hallucinogens in ancient Tibet. And he had decided he was going to learn Tibetan in order to figure this out for real. Like
there's a bit of a megalomaniac in here.
Yeah. But he's also, again, notice he's insanely curious, right? He's 20 years old. He's in Tibet and he decides, you know what? I think I'm going to stay here until I figure out this like grand historical religious mystery. I wouldn't do that, right?
I'm here to fuck some moms. Discover the nature of Tibetan religious thinking. Not necessarily in that order.
Right. But nonetheless, he does this for months, and then he realizes is like, this project is way too big for me. Like it's not really going to happen. So it ends up just being like another one of these sort of interesting things that he kind of studied and pursued as far as he could, and then it was kind of time to hang it up and move on to the next thing.
Could I just add that while he was doing that in Tibet, Nepal, he had his rooftop sex experience. But
talk about that.
He saw, when he looked into this like weird purple sex love liquid, he saw the face of that Tibetan monk, his lama, and he was like looking back at him, and he knew that he was sleeping a couple miles away. But, like, he was there, so like I have this little drawing of him there, so I just wanted to put that in.
Oh yeah, no, Terence had this I think how it worked, he had brought some drugs with him, and I mean he was kind of running out by this time, but he and a woman I think she was English, she wasn't Nepalese by any means, she was a Westerner of some kind, I think she was English, who he'd met out there, they did DMT together, and he was like already on LSD, I think. And they had this insane, like, the highest anybody's ever been sort of situation. And in part of it, this purple psycho fluid was instantiated, let's say, according to Terence. And they had sex in the midst of this. And there's Terence has a book in which he does have a passage about this the book's called True Hallucinations, which is mostly about his experiences. We're going to talk about in a little bit in La Chorrera, but deals with this. And it's a kind of a funny story because it's in one hand, Terence is like, yes, I was there, I'm trying to study the ancient roots of the Bon religion, and also I'm just doing a lot of drugs and having sex with other travelers, right? It's like both things are true, right? But there is, well, we'll talk about it. Well, let me plant this here. One thing that happens, this rooftop sex thing that happens in Nepal, is he somehow ends up wearing the girl's underwear, and they're not sure how this happens, right? I guess it's not really that big of a deal, but we're going to see why that's a big deal when we talk about La Chorrera, because it actually does, it's like biographically significant in a certain way. Okay. So hippie trail. Eventually, Terence ends up in Japan. He's teaching English. He hates it so much. He doesn't like living. Well, I think he likes living in Japan at first, but eventually he gets sick of it. He travels on a fake passport to Canada. And so he's then living in British Columbia. This would be like 1968, 69. And he's trying to make a living there. And then, but this kind of starts to draw to a conclusion. His sort of time being an expatriate, an illegal expatriate, starts to kind of come to a close. And we're going to talk about La Chorrera, which is maybe the most significant biographical thing in his life. But I want to hit one note first. 1969, his mother is diagnosed with bone cancer. She had breast cancer several years before and had gone into remission, and now it came back. She had bone cancer. It was pretty serious. They were trying to take care of it, but ultimately, it's the 60s, that the treatments aren't as great, maybe as they are now. And she's dying. Terence is up in Canada. He's living on a fake passport. And when it starts to get really bad, he decides that he's going to try to push it. He's wanted in the United States, as far as he knows. He's afraid that Interpol or the FBI or somebody are going to arrest him the moment he walks off the plane. But he decides he's going to do it anyway because he wants to see his mother before she passes away. So he flies from Vancouver to Los Angeles first. He's trying to get back to Pineal Colorado. And while he's on that flight, his mother, at the age of 57, passes away. Now, he's partially traveled, right? But his mother has just passed away. And the risk he thinks he's running is that he's going to end up in prison because he's coming back to the United States. Now, his father knows about this, and his father makes like a whole bunch of phone calls, really goes over the edge to try and get Terence to go back to Canada before he goes through customs in the United States, before he gets his passport checked in the United States, to try to keep Terence out of jail. This apparently is successful. This stuff must have been in a certain way, it's harder to pull off back in the 60s because you don't have cell phones. But in another, like, the security is way looser. Like it's just bizarre to me that you could even make this happen. But apparently Terence goes back to Canada. So he flew into Los Angeles airport, didn't leave the airport, gets back in a plane, goes back to Canada. It's kind of a crazy story. Interesting that his dad, who did not have any patience for this drug stuff that both Terence and Dennis were up to, did not like it, thought they were crazy, totally disapproved of it. He was dead set on his son not getting into legal trouble, which I think is kind of sweet, honestly. Okay, so now after this, it's like 1970, his mother dies. The next year, after Terence has had this DMT experience, it's blown the doors off everything. We're going to talk more about what DMT means to him. Let me actually read the one statement from Terence about DMT. It plays into La Chorrera, and then we're going to talk about La Chorrera. Because, well, let me just give this to you from Terence. So now, Kevin, as you said, Terence McKenna is like perhaps the biggest popularizer and mythologizer and articulator of what DMT is. And for people who don't know, DMT is a super powerful hallucinogen. It's the active chemical in ayahuasca. Kevin, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say he's sort of like St. John the Baptist to Rogan's Christ in terms of DMT. Joe Rogan, the Bropra, the Bro Oprah, the greatest, one of the greatest podcasters of all time.
Yeah.
Died on the cross for DMT. But he would never, I doubt he would have ever encountered it if it had not been for Terence.
Probably
fair
not.
to say.
That's
so there
true.
you go.
This is what a burnt out DMT vape looks like.
Okay. Oh,
yes. All right.
Oh, yeah. Somebody's so okay. All right. Well, we're gonna have you talk more about it, because I have a question for you after I read this thing from Terence. I have a question for you, Pineal. Okay. So Terence is well known. Many people, not just Joe Rogan, were introduced at least to the concept of DMT through Terence talking about it, right? So let me give you one of his raps that I think maybe encapsulates it in the smallest amount of words. The thing about DMT, quote from Terence McKenna, the thing about DMT that is the most astonishing and the most appalling, and its most definitive characteristic, is that for a lot of people, you burst into a place that is absolutely swarming with some kind of intelligent life. I call them self-transforming elf machines. It is definitely an elf place. You thought you were going to get the white light, or you thought you were going to get a Huxley-esque aphorism on, form and void. And no, you've got 16 elves trying to get inside your clothes in this broom closet in hyperspace you've stumbled into. It's very odd. My personal model for all this is that it's a series of concentric shells. All psychedelic experiences lead into this elf-infested backwoods place, but most psychedelics can't quite carry you there. A lot of people go to that place on DMT, but when they come down, they have no memory of that part of the trip, because at that moment, when you encounter this tribe of elves, your choices are pretty stark. You have to either immediately jettison everything you've ever believed about reality, or you have to embrace the idea that you are now absolutely crackers. For me, it was an easy choice to make. I want to learn from these things. They are not merely observing. These elves, they are waiting for you, and they will immediately start speaking to you in a language of the visibly beheld logos. These elves, which look like jeweled, self-dribbling basketballs or something, they start to sing. They start to sing in these crystalline, high-pitched, warbling voices, and that voice condenses as objects and words and other little beings. And when they offer you these objects, a single one of these objects, if you could bring it into this room, would change the course of the world forever. So that's what Terence thought about DMT. Now, he would talk about it many times in many ways, but they generally had this flavor. This is the DMT folk. This is the folklore of the DMT realm that Terence McKenna articulated, and which many other people have repeated. And so I want to ask you, Pineal, does this jive with your experience of DMT?
Right. Certain aspects of it do, yes. Sometimes it, like these DMT pens, you can't break through on them. I found, and then everything I've read about them online, no, you can't break through.
What does that mean when you say break through? What is that?
Like break the ceiling, like when you are still conscious, but you do go to that other place, and everything around you is completely changed.
So they've heard this quote referred to as the waiting room versus the full what Terence would call the DM versus the DMT flash, as Terence would call it, I think. Yeah.
I did have just last week I fasted for a few days, and I was vaping this, and I was having like just really good self-aligning, just laying there like meditating, going through stuff, like some stuff more powerful than other. And then ate just junk food all day one day, sugar and stuff, and I was vaping, and it was at night, and it was just like everything changed. There was just anxiety all in my body I could feel, and there's this big hovering presence right there, and I had to open my eyes, and it was still darkness, and I had to get up.
Whoa.
I took myself. It was just the sugar. I'm finding the sugar is just just added just this extra anxious level to everything.
Yeah, I think sugar might be a worse drug for you than DMT. I think. Yeah, it's interesting. Kevin, you mentioned that like Joe Rogan's like maybe the biggest popularizer, but like I've heard him describe DMT experiences, and he basically just says what Terence said. And then I kind of wondered, like, is he? I'm not saying Joe Rogan didn't do it. I'm not calling Joe Rogan a phony. I'm like, did he have that experience because he was primed by Terence McKenna to have that experience?
See, because language is a spell, spells, spelling, grammar, all of that business. Yeah. So if you expect a certain experience prior to doing the thing, I could see Terrence's charismatic language really coloring your experience. I, in Minecraft, saw the devil on DMT, or a devil. Then a UFO landed on my head, a big fractal crystalline UFO, and I pierced through it into the chamber, so described. I did not think of the beings as elves. Rather, I read it as a kind of holy guardian angel. And the creatures together formed the angel. It was like an angelic choir of light. And they were urging me to commune with them. And I did. And it was a wonderful, wonderful feeling. So a similar experience to what Terence described, but I put my own language on it. I don't know that I like the word the phrase machine elf. That wasn't really my experience of it. But I could see how someone else might think of it that way. Terence was kind of scientifically minded, right, wasn't he? So
this is what I started to wonder. It's like Joe Rogan maybe is primed by, and other people who claim that they have the self-transforming machine elves is kind of primed by Terence McKenna, and Terence McKenna is sort of primed by like pulp sci-fi, right? And that's not to water it down. It's just like well, like when you have a dream, it's your brain is representing stuff, mostly versions of stuff you've already seen. It's like that's the material that it has to use, right? And so if your material is pulp science fiction, then maybe you see it a certain way. And if your material is something else, then you have it a different way.
Right. If you're a baker, you might go, oh, the cosmic donut.
Really,
told seriously, me that though, we needed to make more Bavarian cream-filled donuts.
Right, because Terence was always talking about like, well, what they want you to do, what the entities want you to do, is they want you to teach them something. They're going to teach you this visible language, and then they want you to trade a meme back with them.
That's 100% what happened to me, but I read it as almost like prayer is how I read it. Now, I could have been irreparably damaged by the Catholic Church, the one true faith. Well, that's true.
Yeah, you've got a Catholic.
And so I have my own sort of problems.
You'd have your own. Well, you'd have your own sort of aesthetic dimension to the whole thing, right?
Yeah, right.
So, I thought
mine, of course, is correct because I was
right. Everybody else is just insane. But what I went through.
Right. In my experience, which is the correct experience.
Right. Well, okay. Well, hopefully if
I'm never going to make it through grad school again like this. Am I?
You're not. Yeah. If I ever do DMT, maybe I'll have your experience. We'll see.
Well, that's just your experience, Brad.
So let me give you one other thing about his description of DMT. And the reason I'm hitting this is because it's like one of the things he's most well known for, right? Here's another thing, him talking about DMT. Quote, DMT is zany. It's like a Warner Brothers cartoon. It's all in fun. But these guys might be so rough that their idea of fun might be to hand you 4 sticks of dynamite on a short fuse. It's interesting. Here's another thing he said. It seemed to me that the entities in there are like meme traders. That's MEME. They're in there and they show you all this stuff. It's the equivalent of trade goods, beads and baubles to trade with the natives in Newtonian space. That's you and I. We're the natives in Newtonian space. And the elves are saying, wouldn't you like this? Take a look at this. And you're like some poor Amazonian Indian being shown fountain pens where when you turn them upside down, ladies undress, But do we have what they want? I'm not really sure. So he thinks of it almost like a population of entities that you can interact with under the influence of DMT. That's how he would relate to it. And unlike a lot of people I know referring to their DMT experiences are perfectly willing to hedge and sort of say, this is all in my head. It's felt real, but it was in my head. Terence doesn't talk that way. Terence is like, no, there are some things out there in hyperspace, and this is the way to get there is through DMT. So interesting, I think. I would say almost infinitely interesting. And Terence would often also be surprised, be like, I don't understand why this isn't a bigger deal. Like, he'd sort of be like, don't you understand what I'm saying? How is not everybody doing DMT right now? Like, he would sometimes almost seem confused by the fact that this wasn't a front page news story, which I always thought was kind of interesting. Now, the one issue that he'd had in the 60s with DMT, the one sort of question he'd had was, well, it's such a short lasting experience. And for people who don't know, it lasts, between 5 and 15 minutes, with the peak of it being, in that 5-minute range usually. And Terence and his brother Dennis were like, well, can we we want this to last longer? Like, this isn't, you can't really get there doing it this way, right? You're in and out so quickly that you can't process it. And again, Terence wants
the complaint of millions of women all throughout history.
Like, it's over? It's already over?
Yeah, talk about a machine elf. Oof.
Oh boy. So Terence and Dennis.
It's not the size of the machine elf that counts.
It's the self-transforming of it or something.
Right.
Yeah. So Terence and Dennis, who again, total nerds of the best sort, they're trying to figure out what they can do to prolong the DMT experience. They read in an article by Richard Evans Schultes, who's a famous, really the first ethnobotanist. They read an article from him about a DMT containing snuff called ukuhe in South America. And so what do the McKenna boys decide to do in 1971? Terence McKenna is 25 years old. Dennis is about 20. They decide to go with some of their friends to find this remote mission in South America. This is would lead to the period in Terence's life that he wrote about in True Hallucinations called the Experiment at La Chorrera. Neil, what can you tell us about the Experiment at La Chorrera?
Well, they were a simple version would be they're trying to blend harmony, tryptamine, and a human being together. Yeah, just go back to you. Let me find.
Okay, yeah. Well, one thing, let me give you. So there's a little bit of like the lead up to the experiment itself is kind of interesting. So they go and they don't really know. They kind of know where they're going, but this is pre-internet, so you're kind of going on like speculation and rumor, and like you talk to this guy who did this thing, and so they do land here. They end up having to do this like 4-day overland jungle expedition to get to this place, La Chorrera. And they're kids. They don't have a lot of it's Terence, his brother Dennis. It's this girl named Ev, it's this girl named Vanessa, who had formerly been involved with Terence romantically, but they weren't any longer. And then it was this couple that had broken up, this guy named Solo and his ex-girlfriend named Ev. Solo was like the hippiest hippie that ever hippied. Okay, so he traveled, he wouldn't eat, he was a fruitarian, which that's fine. But he wouldn't even use a metal knife on fruit because he believed it would damage the essence of the fruit. So he would use a wooden knife to cut like a piece of fruit.
Who is this?
This is a guy, I don't even think Terence would call him a friend, that was part of Terence's sort of traveling group when they were going to La Chorrera.
Right.
And this solo guy traveled with like a bunch of like monkeys and dogs and cats and stuff. And they're like, dude, you realize we're traveling through the jungle, right? And, you know, he's got like...
Okay.
And he would at times
claim... When did Reagan shut the asylums down in California? That was in the 70s.
I think it was. This was 1971. He might have been. He might have just missed it.
Right.
But yeah, so he's traveling, and a lot of True Hallucinations. The book is talking about like, man, this solo guy was really getting on our nerves. And at one point in this overland jungle trip, Solo's teeth are like rotting out. Probably because of some hygiene practice he like thought was spiritually irredeemable or something. And so they send Solo back and to like go to go back to Bogota or whatever. And as far as I know from reading True Hallucinations, they never heard from him again. Like he just like walked, like that was the last they heard of Solo. And they literally never heard a word from him again, which is sort of funny, eerie,
more innocent times.
Yeah. Now, here's the thing: they go down to La Chorrera. They are seeking DMT containing snuffs called okuhe. They don't find it. Okay, so what is this? What is the story here? They don't find what they're looking for, so they just go home. This is not the case. They find a tremendous, bountiful harvest of psilocybin containing mushrooms. Everywhere they look, there are psilocybin containing mushrooms. There are cows all over the place. Every cow patty has a cluster of psilocybin mushrooms. More than, as many as you wanted that were there. And this was another thing that's interesting. Kevin, you and I, in the generation we came from, the lowest hanging fruit of psychedelics would be when you were 18 years old, the easiest hallucinogen to get your hands on was probably mushrooms, I would say.
Robitussin.
Yeah,
no, it doesn't qualify. Don't do that. Don't do that. Mushrooms.
Like,
everybody,
if you knew a dude, if you knew a dude,
there'd always be some guy who maybe have a certain odor, a certain kind of hair. Generally, the hair might not be that well kept.
Yeah, you get your hands on it.
Yeah, and you just say, "Oh, I'm interested in have you heard of this band Pink Floyd?" "Oh yeah, I like Pink Floyd." And then and then you find out that he's got a closet. He lives in his grandmother's place. It's not clear whether he's 16 years old or 26 years old. You can't tell. That guy, you want to find that guy.
Yeah.
He might work at a hardware store.
Right.
You know,
you have you have a very specific person in mind. But yeah, that guy is in every town in 1999. That guy's in every town.
He might even be the karate man in town. The karate man might be interested. The guy who runs the karate studio in the strip mall next to the
folks, kids, youngins out there. If you're looking, that's a good place.
You want to find yourself a karate man.
Okay. Yes, you're right. Now, the point I was trying to make, in 1971, Terence's in South America, Terence had done DMT. He'd done plenty of acid. He'd been smoking weed religiously every day for years. He had never eaten mushrooms. And the reason why, it was very difficult to get your hands on mushrooms in 1971 California. And so I just thought this was interesting. He'd done this. He was seeking DMT, and instead of that, they end up. They were seeking this very specific snuff, and instead of that very specific snuff, they end up just eating a lot of mushrooms. And Terence and Dennis concoct this experiment after days and days and days of eating mushrooms. And maybe you can kind of pick up there like what this experiment and here's the thing, we're not going to be able to explain exactly what they were doing because I don't think they even understood exactly what they were doing.
I read Terence's account and I read Dennis's account, and this is what I've come up with.
Okay, good.
So they're taking the mushrooms, they're adding in harmonize. And then Dennis is just like yodeling. He's howling. He's singing. And they're trying to merge these 3Ds, these 4Ds, everything. They're trying to get it together. And then there is a quote he said, and like what they were kind of landing on. It'd be a miniature universe, space and time that magically has all of space and time condensed in it, including one's own mind. A map of the cosmos so real that is somehow is the cosmos. Like that's just they're
it's and so you hear them both describe like what they were trying to do at different times. Now you have to remember Dennis is also a very reputable, he would go on to become a very reputable scientist. At this point he's 20 years old. He's not the man that he would eventually become. Dennis is actually sort of the subject of this experiment, and part of what they were doing, the way that Dennis would describe it, is he was going to try to integrate the DNA of the mushroom into his own DNA through vocal harmonics. And by doing this, Terence would describe what they were trying to do as creating something called the Philosopher's Stone, because Terence is obsessed with Western occultism. And so his idea was they were doing real alchemy. They were going to create a thing that would be in the actual world that would somehow bring history to an end. And I know this sounds a little nuts. And it is a little nuts. Dennis would later go on to say it was kind of nuts, though it was a sort of a learning experience. I think the shortest, easiest way to say it is Terence and Dennis got as high as two people have ever gotten in history. Okay.
I got to get a theremin that I can put over here and play periodically. Yeah. I'm going to go on Angie's list and see if somebody's giving away a theremin.
Yeah. Now I don't mean to say that to demean it, because I think they were trying to do something that was not ultimately possible, but there was something there that they were probing at the edges of. They were trying to bring everything that they knew at this time, Terence 25 and Dennis 20, into concrescence. And Terence was trying to do the thing that he talked about, which was go into the shamanic realm and bring something back, because he's a scientist, right? He wants to verify and prove that what happens in the shamanic space isn't just a dream. It's actually something that's happening, right? So the idea is try to bring something back. Now, I don't think they bring anything back. However, some weird things do happen. One thing that happens is apparently they have like one big mushroom in the middle of this hut the night they're doing it. And when they wake up, or when they kind of start coming back to, they both, Terence and Dennis, both look at it and they see a planet. They see the big mushroom as a planet, as planet Earth. And Dennis makes a comment about how again, remember, they're thinking that they're going to somehow end history, not in an apocalyptic way, but like break humanity out of time somehow through creating the Philosopher's Stone, this moment, this object of such immense novelty that it sort of breaks reality out of its frame somehow. Now, Dennis makes a point about seeing the mushroom and the planet. He makes a point that the mushroom cloud of the atom bomb is some kind of grand historical visual pun, that the mushroom that you eat and the mushroom cloud are the same thing. And they talk about this as being the visual representation of what they would call the eschaton. Okay, Kevin, you know about the word eschaton, right? It's become like a Twitter.
Yeah, I have. I think I have a Substack that I don't do too much on, although I kind of want to change that at some point. You can find me through the artofdarkpod.com website. Yeah, I think I called my Substack eschaton. Yeah, the end of days. You've heard the phrase.
Yeah, you've heard the phrase "immanentize the eschaton," right?
Yes, that's a good warm up.
I think Terence invented that word, talking about what they were trying to do with the experiment at La Trevera.
What's funny is that they may have accomplished that.
This is yes. This is my point. They didn't accomplish nothing. Is the point that I want to make with this? Okay. So now here's the thing: you take a bunch of drugs.
I'm going to say, hang on. We are going to immanentize our Patreon. Patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Go on, Brett.
Okay. So they do this experiment. They get super high, whatever. Everybody's been there where they've kind of pushed it too far past the limit. They've been eating mushrooms. They also were drinking ayahuasca in combination with this, but apparently it's fairly low dose. They were also leading up to this. They were doing something very interesting that I'd never heard of anybody doing. They were actually smoking ayahuasca. They were smoking ayahuasca vine, which is I'd never heard of anybody doing that before. It's very interesting. But anyway, they have this moment, the big moment, the experiment at La Chorrera, and there's all kinds of sort of pseudo magical components to it. But this is the thing. Dennis never comes down. The next day, Dennis would describe himself as being smeared across the universe. And as weeks go by, his perspective gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. But when it starts, he is smeared across the universe. And apparently he's saying that he's talking to some intelligence that they would call the teacher, or they would call the mushroom, and they could query it and it would answer any question that they had, and that this period lasted forever. Right. So super high.
This makes me think of Crowley and his talking with aliens and alien intelligence and all the rest. Yeah, very curious.
Dennis has what he calls a phone call with his mother from 1953, where he literally communicates with his mother. She's answering the phone in 1953. Terence claims that he actually has a memory of this phone call happening back in 1953. I don't know what that's all about. Dennis, at one point, remember when I was telling you about Terence on that rooftop? He ends up wearing that girl's underwear. Remember that, Kevin? I pointed that out. He has this whole drug experience back in Nepal.
Yeah. As that was happening, I was thinking more again about Francis Bacon. There are these uncanny parallels because, anyway, go on. Yeah.
At one point, Terence, never having told this story to anybody because it was kind of embarrassing, Dennis turns to Terence and says, "You're wearing my knickers."
Whoa.
You're wearing my knickers. He imitates this moment. He relives this moment that he had no access to, right? Okay. So at one point, they're talking about, and as weeks go by, they think they've succeeded, but that the Philosopher's Stone is in the future someplace. And Pineal, if I'm getting anything any other stuff you want to add in, just holler at me. So they think they've created it, but it hasn't quite happened yet, that it's in the future and they're still coming towards it. Terence keeps pushing Dennis to create something, show him the thing, the Philosopher's Stone, what is this thing you've created and you're making for us? And Dennis, sitting in his underwear in the middle of the jungle, starts talking about this box that their grandfather had, like an inlaid wood box. It's like an heirloom. And the key had been lost for years. And Dennis says something along the lines, or Terence starts talking. They're talking about this box. And Dennis at some point says, well, would you like, I don't know who said what exactly, but at one point, one of them starts talking about the key. And then Dennis slaps Terence's hand and puts a little silver key in it. That is purportedly the same key that went to the box, right? Years and years and years later, middle of the jungle in South America, sitting in his underwear, Dennis happens to have the key to a box that they're talking about, right? Now, as this time goes on, Terence is apparently not sleeping. Terence claims he doesn't sleep for 9 days, right? Which I don't even know what that means exactly. I don't even know how you can do this. 9 days without being tired. And as it's drawing to a close, Dennis is getting a little bit better as time goes on, and Terence is insistent with the rest of the group that all he needs is time, and that if they take him back to civilization right away, it's going to actually be worse. He just needs time to concress, to come back to being Dennis. And for a while, the group goes along with that, until the point where Dennis slips away and he runs into the mission center and he's ringing a bell, and the very small mission police force kind of get involved, and it ends up that they have to leave. But the last night before they leave La Chorrera, Terence has this vision of a UFO. Okay, he sees this UFO rising up off the horizon, and purportedly he's not doing drugs anymore. They hadn't been continually eating mushrooms. They had done it, and this is the multi-day after effects. Terence sees this UFO and he says it looks like a famous UFO that's called the George Adamski UFO, which is a hoax, and which Terence knew as a hoax and believed to have been a hoax. So I know that seems okay. What's the big deal? This to Terence was stranger than if he'd seen a UFO, because if he'd seen a UFO, then hey, there's UFOs. That's like, it's crazy, but it's a UFO. There's aliens in it. Okay, they exist. It's all cool. But imagine seeing what you know to be a hoax UFO coming out. It's like he was projecting UFOs out into reality. This from his perspective. Like, to him, it was a very much like Carl Jung would say that UFOs are actually projections of our own anxiety about about scientific materialism closing the doors on the mystery, and so we project a mystery out there. That's what Terence thought he was doing, was actually making this thing come out of his mind and show up on the horizon, and it was showing up as a hoax so that he would sort of know that it wasn't a physical ship from another planet, but he was actually sort of like rending reality in some way. So anyway, I thought that was all pretty interesting. The whole experimental La Chorrera thing is pretty crazy.
And that was that in Peru?
This would have been in Colombia, 1971.
Oh, okay. La Chorrera, Colombia. Okay.
Yeah.
The just the UFO thing, I wanted to
please.
mention that in 1966 up to the 70s and before, there was the same. It was UFO with orange lights, orange on it with blue lights coming out from it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was seen by several witnesses at the site, where eventually it was one electrician was found dead there the one year, and then the next year two more were, and they all they're part of the scientific spiritual movement in the 70s. It was called scientific spiritualism, and they were all found with like these sunglasses on. They were trying to make contact with Mars, and they all, like, I don't know if the drug, they took these tablets before they did, and they all ended up dead. So I'm not sure if they were like, if there was some sort of electricity going on, or it was just the tablets. But
right,
yeah, it was the same, like orange and blue UFOs going on in Brazil.
Same kind of UFO that Terence saw, right? So so there's something going on. And here's the thing about UFOs. Terence was not like a big UFO guy. Like I said in the beginning, he's not really into this new age stuff. It seems like he should be, but he's really not. Like, he was very dismissive of like the 80s and 90s like UFO cult kind of stuff. He thought it was his attitude was like, why would these ships travel light years to reach us when they can just reach you interdimensionally? Like, why would you see a 1,000-ton beryllium ship in the sky? It doesn't make any sense, right? So there's a couple of things. So experiment at La Chorrera, it's really easy to say that nothing happened, right? Like, okay, you guys just got really high and it got kind of scary and kind of weird, and then you came home and that was it. And it's not really that big of a deal. However, Terence would then go on to have this career, right? And Dennis would go on to have this career and become a very well-respected scientist in realms of, ethnopharmacology and ethnobotany and all of these other things. I think Dennis ends up having like 3 PhDs or something like that. Like, he's a heavy hitter in this world, and the real science aspect of these things. Here's another thing though. So they go back. Terence goes back to Berkeley. He does end up deciding when he gets back that he wants to go back to Berkeley. And, as I said, he thought he was on the run from the police still when he's down in Colombia even, right? He's traveling on a fake Australian passport and all of this. He decides that in order to go to Berkeley, he's going to have to finally like face the music on this whole hashish rap. Apparently, he and his dad go to some FBI branch or something in Colorado, and he turns himself in, and it takes him a while to even like figure out what he's talking about, right? So the story is that Terence has been on the lam, running, kind of scared, traveling on fake passports for something that nobody really even cared about. Dennis says that he thinks that Terence ended up with a 3-year suspended, basically a 3-year probation with no requirements to like meet with anybody. Like it basically, per Dennis and Terence, it kind of just disappeared in a puff of smoke.
Yeah, the parole officer didn't want to sit and listen to him talk about elves in his head for 90 minutes.
Right. Right. Now, so Terence ends up going back to Berkeley. He's got this cool job, which to me sounds really cool. So one thing, when Terence had been traveling like the hippie trail and various things, one thing that he liked to do as like cover to make himself seem innocuous, but also he did it genuinely, he would collect butterflies. So he would go someplace and he's in pursuit of like a kuhe in South America. He's got a butterfly net. And, he just looks like an eccentric eccentric Westerner out catching butterflies. But he was able to kind of parlay this interest in insects and things that he'd always had into a job mounting butterflies, which apparently paid really well. So he's living in Berkeley. He's mounting butterflies. It's a work from home job. So he's literally mounting butterflies. Butterflies show up and the materials show up. He mounts them. He's just smoking weed all day. People are dropping in. He's talking to them while he mounts butterflies, and he's like making a reasonably good living at it in the early 70s. He's also writing, he and Dennis are writing a book that would eventually come out that was called Invisible Landscapes. That was like an attempt to write a sort of a pseudo-scientific treatise on what happened at La Chorrera. This would be the first time in text that Terence would start to articulate the time wave, because he got the initial idea for the time wave at La Chorrera, though he didn't feel like he didn't really understand it yet. He hadn't quite brought the I Ching to bear on it yet, but this is all sort of starting to happen in the early 70s. And then Terence and Dennis together in about 1975, they put together what is probably their biggest impact on the broader culture, a little book called The Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. So, Kevin, here's the thing about this. If you Google right now how to grow mushrooms,
that book appears.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't appear, you will find yourself on a forum that will give you a methodology for growing mushrooms that is more or less copy pasted from Terence and Dennis's book.
Pretty sure that PDF is widely circulating. Wait, so it's their book? They wrote it under pseudonyms, but he did the foreword? Is that the idea? Okay.
Yeah, they wrote the foreword and they wrote the methodology and they figured out how to do it. Like, so this is the thing. Thanks, guys. Thank you. It seems insignificant in a way. It sort of seems like silly, but like literally nobody knew how to grow mushrooms before this.
Yeah, here's this about the Philosopher's Stone.
Yeah, go ahead.
Experiment. We have
please.
not condensed the stone into visible space, but we have generated it in our heads, teaching in the flesh. It was not a condensed hyper object, but a teaching. So so every time he teaches,
right, that's the thing. It's like, okay, they did this experiment at La Chorrera and it's silly and all they did was get really high and get scary, but they also wrote a book that taught the rest of the world how to grow mushrooms. So like and it's interesting how they figured out how to do it. They're such nerds that Dennis found in some obscure scientific journal a little article about preparing fungal samples for testing in a laboratory setting, right? And it's some obscure thing. Probably 15 people had read this article, and Terence and Dennis were like, I bet we could use this to grow psilocybin mushrooms. They brought some spore prints back from South America and they started testing this method, and it's basically the method that you will find now for the easiest way to grow some amount of a personal amount of mushrooms. And they put this book out in 1975. I just think this is really interesting that like they kind of went the next step of like, instead of like, hey, mushrooms are cool, we had this cool experience, people should do them, to like, all right, let's publish a book about how people can grow this stuff in their closet. Not only that, 1975 comes around when Magic Mushrooms Growers Guide comes out. Terence gets married to this woman, Kat Harrison, who an amazing woman in her own right, who's still around. She and Terence started this thing called Botanical Dimensions, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But very early, sort of the proto version of Botanical Dimensions, what they did was sell spores. So you would have in 1976, you would maybe buy a copy at some head shop or something of the Magic Mushrooms Growers Guide, and the last page would be an advertisement to have spores mail ordered to you from Terence's company, Terence and Kathleen's company, Terence and Kat Harrison's company. So I mean, he's as responsible as anybody else for making psilocybin mushrooms like a thing that people, a cultural event and a cultural
right. And it
thing.
Can't be overstated the impact that this has had. This is huge. When you think of all the people who have been impacted by the use of psilocybin mushrooms and what they've gone on to do. Mm-hmm. And how it affected the culture. This is a major moment.
It really is. And the more I got to thinking about it, and the fact that before he went to La Chorrera, Terence had never even eaten mushrooms, right? Like you couldn't get them in Berkeley. Mushrooms weren't a thing in Haight-Ashbury. There was acid. There wasn't really a lot of mushrooms around. And that Terence kind of bridged that into the late 70s period, where then it became a thing. And if you did mushrooms, and if you're listening to this and you did mushrooms in high school or recently, somebody probably used Terence method to grow them.
100%.
Yeah.
The guy from the hardware store I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And so, yes. And the politics of this too are quite interesting because acid is man-made. Acid is artificial. Right. Mushrooms grow in cow shit.
Right.
They're au naturel.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a very interesting dynamic at play here.
Yeah. Let me read. So a lot of the Magic Mushrooms Growers Guide is just an instructional manual for how to do this. It's fairly straightforward, whatever. But the foreword is quite interesting. It was written by Terence. Terence and Dennis wrote this book initially under pseudonyms. Later on, it'd be published under their own names when they had, less to lose, I suppose. But let me read you the foreword, which was written by, or part of the foreword as it was written by Terence. Our method is scientific, but our opinions about Strophoria cubensis, that's the mushrooms, are not. Our opinions in this matter do not rest upon the opinions of others, nor upon anything written in any book. Instead, they rest upon the experience of 5 dried grams of this psilocybin mushroom. At that level, a peculiar phenomenon occurs. It is the emergence of an I-thou relationship between the person taking the psilocybin and the mental state it evokes. Jung calls this transference, and it was a necessary condition of early and primitive humanity's relationship to its gods and demons. The mushroom speaks, and our opinions rest upon what it tells eloquently of itself in the cool night of the mind. The mushroom says, and he's speaking as the mushroom now, I am old, older than thought in your species, which is itself 50 times older than your history. Though I have been on Earth for ages, I am from the stars. My home is no one planet, for many worlds scattered through the shining disk of the galaxy have conditions which allow my spores an opportunity for life. The mushroom which you see is the part of my body given to sex thrills and sunbathing. My true body is a fine network of fibers growing through the soil. These networks may cover acres and may have far more connections than the number in a human brain. My mycelial network is nearly immortal. Only the sudden toxification of a planet or the explosion of its parent star can wipe me out. By means impossible to explain because of certain misconceptions in your model of reality, all my mycelial networks in the galaxy are in hyperlight communication across space and time. The mycelial body is as fragile as a spider's web, but the collective hypermind and memory is a vast historical archive of the career of evolving intelligence on many worlds in our spiral star swarm. Space, you see, is a vast ocean to those hardy life forms that have the ability to reproduce from spores, for spores are covered with the hardest organic substance known. Across the eons of time and space drift many spore-forming life forms in suspended animation for millions of years until contact is made with a suitable environment. Few such species are minded. Only myself and my recently evolved near relatives have achieved the hypercommunication mode and memory capacity that makes us leading members in a community of galactic intelligence. How the hypercommunication mode operates is a secret which will not be lightly given to humans, but the means should be obvious. It is the occurrence of psilocybin and psilocin in the biosynthetic pathways of my living body that opens for me and my symbiotes the vision screens to many worlds. So he is constructing a mythos, and he would sort of walk back this a little bit later in life, but not really. He's constructing a mythos of the mushroom experience, just like he does with the DMT experience, right? He's the articulator. He's the guy who can go into the space and come back and articulate something of it, right? Whether we choose to agree that he's makes sense or he's right or it's true, he's gone beyond like, and it was crazy and it was fun. Like he is definitely he's trying to do what he would do later in the Archaic Revival, where he's trying to use these substances as a pathway to understanding like the deep almost mythological reality of being a human being. Yeah.
Yeah, no big deal. Can I also say can I also say we have a small but growing Telegram channel. If you're interested in connecting with us, you can find that on our website at artofdarkpod.com. All the links are there. Brad runs a very hopping Twitter account. Mm-hmm. And we love hearing from people. And the Telegram link is pretty easy too. It's just t.me/artofdarkpod. Right. If we get something wrong, just pretend you didn't hear it. No, we like to make corrections. I very famously got H.P. Lovecraft wrong. Yeah. I conflated his place. I put him in Baltimore rather than Rhode Island, and oh gosh, whatever. We're not perfect. One of our new Patreon subscribers just described himself as a para-academic.
Oh, I like that.
And I'm like, that's good. Yeah, I would say that we're para-academics, Brad. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, just a quick little pause to say we got a chat going. So
I like that.
And by the way, and Pineal, the art you did for McKenna here is dynamite.
Might be the best one yet.
It's very cool.
The drawing one that Kat drew?
Not the drawing one, but the sort of. The one where
he sent it a while back.
Yeah, it's been a while. We've had this, but he's seated in a yoga pose and he's got three eyes and tremendous.
Very good.
Maybe the best way we're on all the various different channels. We're on YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify. Chuck us some money. If you can't chuck us some money, I don't know what you're doing. Get a job. I'm kidding. But give us 5 stars. Go on to Spotify, give us 5 stars. Give us 5 stars on iTunes. Say, hey, this show doesn't suck. It's not just another podcast. It's an effort pod. We lift heavy. If you want to see Pineal's art, you can go to the website at Art of Dark Pod. But Spotify also really does a good job of curating podcasts, and it looks very cool. And the way we have this set up is that all the core episodes are colorful. They all have her colorful psychedelic portraits. We take an existing photograph and she adapts them and makes them look cool. And then when we do our darkroom episodes, those are kind of black and white and grayscale, and I kind of do a collage thing for those. But our core episodes are by far and away the most popular episodes. But don't sleep on the darkroom episodes. We've got some really good guests, and we take a subject and we go kind of deeper into them. Typically with somebody who's either always passionate about the subject, but has maybe some different angle, so those are fun too. Don't sleep on those.
Those are good. The last one we had, Bernard Joy, he's just finished his thesis on William Faulkner, right? He's a very, very perceptive and interesting guy with a kind of a unique take. So, try to get figures. I like to say we bring on people who know more know more about our subjects or know our subjects differently than we do, right? So even if they just have an interesting take on them, that's worth exploring for an hour. That's often how it goes. So thanks for that, Kevin. That's that we need that, because I start steamrolling here, man. You can tell I'm getting into the zone. I'm getting I'm channeling Terence McKenna, who could talk for 4 hours at a stretch.
We're going into hour three of the pod. Yeah. Remember when we did Burroughs at the beginning and we thought 60 minutes?
Shut it down after an hour.
Yeah. Oh, this is really going long, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about magic mushroom growers guide. 1975 that comes out, also biographically significant for Terence because Terence and Ev, who the woman that he met was with when at La Chorrera, have broken up, and Terence is now in a relationship with Kathleen Harrison, Kat Harrison, who would end up being the mother of his 2 children, who he would end up being married to until 1992, ultimately. They would have 2 children together, as I said. Finn, who was born in 1978. Clea was born in 1980. These are people who are out there. Tao Lin. Yeah, Finn's an artist. Clea, I believe, is a photographer, I think. They're both people who are sort of, they're not much older than us, right? They're out there. Tao Lin, the great writer Tao Lin, did a whole series on Terence McKenna. He interviewed both of them fairly recently, and I've got one little bit that from Finn that I think is interesting to talk about. But anyway, so this is a 1975 is kind of a watershed for Terence because Magic Mushroom Growers Guide comes out. Even though it's under a pseudonym, he's now becoming sort of a known guy. He starts to get on some local radio shows talking. Their book Invisible Landscapes comes out, which is like ends up being like a big hippie kind of thing, right? Because this is about going to the jungle and doing a bunch of drugs. I mean, it comes out in the 70s. And it's like, what better than this? Jerry Garcia read it. Like it had a little bit of its own cult following. By 1983, Terence is invited to this conference at UC Santa Barbara, which is like the biggest psychedelics conference of its time, like academic conference. People like Sasha Shulgin spoke there. Albert Hoffman spoke there. Like the luminaries of the psychedelic scene. Terence was like the sleeper hit of the UC Santa Barbara conference in 1983. His talk was called, what was it called? Oh, I hope I have it here. Hold on a second. Monkeys Discover Hyperspace. That was the title of Terence McKenna's talk at this event, right? And it was the hit of the conference. All of these other luminaries are talking. Terence McKenna, relatively unknown, at least compared to somebody like like Albert Hoffman or Sasha Shulgin. And this is when he becomes kind of a wunderkind. Then it's like, oh, Terence, can you come talk to this thing? He becomes a figure who is going to be invited to places to come and talk. And people are going to sort of sit there just slack-jawed, not even knowing. This is the Terence that we know, where he's sort of inaugurated, right? If you search diligently for Terence McKenna audio, about the earliest you're ever going to find is 1983, 1984. That's about as early as it ever gets. And that's coming right out of this time. Okay. So this is kind of Terence McKenna coming into his own. He would write more books, and we'll talk about that a little bit. He also, I didn't know this until this most recent. He ended up going on Art Bell's show a bunch, which I thought was interesting. And I for some reason, I had missed that.
Cannot wait to do Art Bell.
Yeah, he's a sort of a favorite of mine for sure. Now his whole thing, obviously Terence is kind of known for the psychedelic thing. As the 80s progress, he would become really well known. Kevin, do you know about the Esalen Institute? Is this a name that's familiar to you?
Does that have something to do with Lily?
Lily passed through there. Yeah, John C. Lilly passed through the Esalen Institute, among a number of other people.
I've heard. I'm smelling patchouli again.
Yeah,
I'm picking up the vibe.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about the Esalen Institute in our After Dark, which is all about determining whether or not Terence McKenna was an intelligence asset, and figuring out what Esalen Institute was all about is a big part of that. Now, Terence McKenna was a fixture at Esalen once he started going there. He was a scholar in residence for a couple of summers in the 80s. And he talked there many times. Probably if you go on YouTube and you search Terence McKenna talks, probably something like a quarter of those talks are going to be at talks he gave at Esalen. Okay. So this is a big factor in his, and it's this institute right on the coast, Big Sur, California, Henry Miller territory, where, there's a big house and you can, rich people go there to have retreats and things. And it's still on, like you could go this weekend to a event at Esalen Institute. It's still around. And it's an interesting place. Like I said, we're going to talk more about it in the After Dark. Did you have anything on Esalen Institute, Pineal? I thought you made a face.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's all right.
No.
If you don't, we're going to talk about it. I have a bunch of dirt, maybe dirt. I don't know if it's really dirt. It's kind of dirt on Esalen Institute. Now, one thing I wanted to make a point about too, we're talking about Terence McKenna, all this psychedelic stuff. It's all about, it's easy to fall into this trap that everything that Terence said or talked about was directly related to psychedelics. The more you dig into it, it's not really the case. He did talk about it a lot, and he was one of the best articulators of it. And he was not only an advocate for psychedelics, but he was sort of raised up as kind of the patron saint of the psychedelic community. I mean, he would end up in the late 80s and early 90s. He would end up on like albums, right, where they have his spoken voice. He would perform, quote unquote, perform at raves, where you'd have like electronic music playing and he'd be reading something, right? But it wasn't always about psychedelics. Let me read you a little bit of a passage that doesn't really have anything to do with psychedelics. This is from Terence. When you look at the history of the universe, if you look with unbiased eyes, I think what you will see is that the universe is a novelty-producing and conserving system of some sort. The early universe was so simple that, and we're now going with science here for a minute, we're asked to believe that it sprang from nothingness in a single moment, that its diameter was less than that of an electron. And then, in a very short period of time, a number of very dramatic things happened. But they are all couched in terms of an expansion and cooling. From the moment the universe is born, it begins to cool. And as it cools, complexity magically crystallizes out. In the original universe, there weren't even atoms because there were such high temperatures that atoms could not stabilize themselves into orbit around atomic nuclei. So there was what's called a plasma, just a soup of naked electrons. And then gradually, as the universe cooled, the simplest of all atomic systems was able to form, the hydrogen atom. And these hydrogen atoms were produced in staggering amounts, and they began to clump together. And this is tricky, but not our problem. This is a problem for science. They don't know why they clumped because it should have all been smooth right down to today, but it isn't. So in this clumping process, of course, great temperatures and pressures were created at the centers of these masses of hydrogen, and a novel process, therefore, could spring into existence, the process of fusion. And fusion of hydrogen in early stars cooked out heavier elements, iron, sulfur, and especially carbon. Well, after that, then you get all these atomic species, and then they can aggregate into molecular species. And then because of the presence of 4 valent carbon, very complex molecules called polymers can form. Some of them acquire the quality of being able to replicate. Some of them acquire the ability to enclose themselves in a membrane, and so forth and so on. And in short, the march is on toward you and I here this evening. But what's interesting to note is that each successive stage in this process happens more rapidly than the process which repeated it. So that the early universe, 10 billion years goes on, and it's all about this star formation cookout thing, and then planetary formation. Then once you get, and then once it happens, the eukaryotes follow fast, and after them, the ciliated protozoas, and then, it's just a moment to Madonna, both Madonnas, right? So he could talk about science. This is all
both Madonnas.
Did you get that?
Yeah.
Right. So he always had a little joke in there. But my point is,
he ends on a punchline.
He ends on a punchline. He's a showman in a way, right? But all of the things he said are scientifically accurate, right? And he could talk for hours about things, astronomical, biological phenomena. He talked about. There's a great 4.5-hour Terence McKenna talk about Hermeticism and Gnosticism, which is enthralling. If you're me, I guess. Maybe not everybody's into it. I loved it. I've listened to it a couple times. But so he could do a lot of different things, right? He was a polymath in an academic sense, right? And eventually he would start to bring this to bear on the time wave. Eventually he's wanting to make the time wave work mathematically, like actually figure out he had people help him write software. He was trying to really understand how this thing actually worked. And I think that's really interesting that he wanted to make it sort of legitimate and serious in some way. And we're going to backtrack, but maybe this is a good time. Well, let me read something from Dennis about the time wave. And Dennis loved Terence, right? Here's what Dennis said about the time wave. I'll save my critique of the time wave as a scientific theory for another chapter. Whatever its value in that regard, constructing and calibrating the time wave was, for Terence, an alchemical exercise. That is, an ongoing act of individuation in the Jungian sense. Ultimately, it was clear he'd been trying to map his own odyssey through time as much as define time's hidden structure. As all theories of everything must be, his was only partially successful, and so the pursuit of his individuation remained a work in progress, never completed, even at the time of his death. But individuation is almost by definition a life's work, an important task that perhaps in the end, few of us ever finish. Now, Terence would latch on. I don't even know if latch on is the right word. Within Terence's rap, the time wave stuff became more and more important, and it became more and more important to sort of fans of his, because it comes with it this millenarian notion that the world is going to end in some way. Now, Terence, people give Terence a hard time because the cursory understanding is, well, Terence said that the world was going to end in 2012 and the world didn't end, so he was an idiot. The thing that Terence actually said, okay, was that novelty would increase to such an extent that everything and it would be novelty increasing on one level and networking increasing on the other level would increase to such an extent that everything would become interconnected, and we would reach a singularity beyond which nothing can be said, and thereby history would end. That's what he actually was saying. And so I don't know about you, but I remember before 2012. And it didn't look like 2022.
I've been trying to forget.
Right.
Yeah, there is some credibility to this claim.
Yeah, I'm not saying the specific date is correct, but if you were to say something like around 2010, we crossed some kind of cultural Rubicon that cannot be gone back, I don't see how that's not true. I mean, maybe you can always say that, but I think there's a metaphorical sense in which you can say Terence was directionally correct in my opinion.
I would agree.
Yeah, everything is interconnected now, right? Supposedly, or it feels that way, or it's supposed to be, or something, right? And instead of it being like all nice and orderly, it's somehow made everything more chaotic and completely unpredictable. Right. And we're in this sort of infinite novelty loop. Right. Like, I think Terence would be interested in the incessant news cycle, the way that like the Nord Stream pipeline can blow up and 12 hours later, nobody even cares anymore. Right. Just the like to me, that's what he was talking about as being this sort of the end of history. Anyway.
Right. Yeah. Well, and of course, Francis Fukuyama famously declared that history had ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dominance of liberal democracy as the sort of final system of government with no plausible alternative. Now, of course, that seems to have been maybe rolled back, or people are kind of squinting at that a little bit. But Terence wasn't alone in saying this. He was just maybe kind of the pulp version of it. Very interesting.
Yeah. And he had, like I said, he had this pattern, but now the thing is, the pattern was, I think Dennis has a good point that it was personal. I think Terence wanted to wake up from history, like the James Joyce quote, history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to wake up. Terence took James Joyce very seriously. In fact, one of the materials they had with him at the experiment at La Torrera was Finnegan's Wake. And at one point after the experiment, both Dennis and Terence said, I think we're living in a James Joyce novel right now. I think James Joyce is in control of this reality we're living in. Terence would sign his letters HCE, which for people who listen to our James Joyce episode stands for Humphrey something Earwicker, or Here Comes Everybody, who's the protagonist of Finnegan's Wake, right? So Terence was very interested in this kind of thinking, this sort of the world is constructed out of language, and then what happens when there's a sort of a narrative collapse around the language, right? Then the world that you built has the reality that's been built out of language then in some way folds in on itself, right? So this is all kind of stuff that's circulating around in old Terence's head. Now, while he's building his fame up and his reputation up, and he's building a following, some people would even call it a cult because it had this millenarian quality to it. He well, let me say something, and then I want to talk to Pineal about what's called the Watkins objective. But first, I want to talk about something that happened in 1988. Now, remember, Terence, the most famous proponent of psychedelics alive in the late 80s and 90s, right? And that maybe he's not that famous, but for a person that's doing that, he's pretty darn famous. He's talking at Esalen all the time, sometimes to groups of thousands of people. Tim Leary called him the most important man of his generation, right? So he's a figure in the late 80s and into the 90s. But in 1988, he and Kat are living in Hawaii. Terence has a mushroom trip that turns on him. Okay, let me see if I can find my note about this. Okay, this is from Dennis McKenna's book, but this, and Pineal, you might have more insight into the behind the scenes on this than I do. There is a paragraph from this Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss that came out in the first edition that was then removed. Nobody's really sure why it was removed exactly. And it goes like this. And this is from Dennis. Terence's pivotal existential crisis came abruptly, sometime in 88 or 89. I don't know exactly when it happened, and I don't know exactly what happened. I'm piecing it together from what Kat, Terence's wife, has told me. It happened when they were living for a time on the Big Island of Hawaii, and it was a mushroom trip they shared that was absolutely terrifying for Terence. It was terrifying because, for some reason, the mushroom turned on him. The gentle, wise, humorous mushroom spirit that he had come to know and trust as an ally and teacher ripped back the facade to reveal an abyss of utter existential despair. Terence kept saying, so Kat told me, that it was a, quote, a lack of all meaning. A lack of all meaning. Okay. Terence references this experience a couple times later. This is from Terence. This trip that I had in Hawaii, I thanked God that somebody was there, that Kat was there specifically, because just the sound of her voice completely ameliorated a whole spectrum of hard to describe but very icky things that were threatening to overwhelm me. And I don't have trips like that very much where I need somebody there. This is another time he was talking. And that's what these psychedelics do. They make you get down and grovel in the dirt. God, I had this trip in Hawaii that was just horrible, where it was saying, you think you're such hot stuff, you won't even get off your ass and go shit in the field. I want to see you grovel, man. You sit in front of all these people and pontificate on how it's all put together. Now face me now in the darkness and tell me how it's all put together. Right. So he has this tremendously disruptive mushroom experience in 1988. Now, according to Dennis, and who knows how true this stuff is, according to Dennis, Terence would never take mushrooms again after this experience in 1988-89, which is a bit challenging when he spends the next decade or so being the public face of mushrooms. It's a little bit hard to reconcile He didn't publicly acknowledge that he wasn't taking mushrooms for the last decade of his life. He apparently would occasionally take DMT and had some ayahuasca trips, though somewhat reluctantly. Now, Bruce Damer, this is how Bruce Damer kind of talks about it. Bruce Damer is this another polymath, almost like a Terence McKenna-like figure. He's a guy who's consulted with NASA and a bunch of other things. Very interesting guy, a little bit younger than Terence, but was a close friend of Terence's. Bruce Damer says that what he thinks happened is, as long as the psychedelic experience remained cerebral, Terence could handle anything. As long as it stayed in, we're talking to entities from interdimensional and we're learning things and it's aesthetically weird and all of that was fine. But as soon as it made him face himself, as soon as the entities or the mushroom or whatever held up a mirror to Terence, he could not handle it. And he wasn't able or willing to delve into this confrontation with himself. And so that's the point where he stopped doing them. Now, this is where it gets challenging because you're Terence McKenna. You are, again, the most famous advocate for psychedelics in the world. Not only that, your career is based on traveling around the world and talking to people about psychedelics in a positive way. You have a mathematical, philosophical concept that you believe the mushroom told you, and yet you are scared to ever do mushrooms again in your life.
It's like Willie Nelson without his guitar.
Right. Right. No, so, but think about what that would, because I think that Terence is fundamentally an honest, well-intentioned person. I don't think he's a bad person at all. But I think he finds himself in a crisis after this 1988-89 thing where it's like, I have a cult following. Like, this is my whole life is I'm the mushroom guy. But he's not doing them anymore, right? And after 1988, sometime, and I don't know if it has anything to do with his mushroom trip or not, but his marriage starts to decline. And eventually he and Kat would divorce in 1992. The circumstances around that are not particularly well publicized. Somebody out there knows the story. I don't know the story of, the specifics of their divorce, but they get divorced in 1992. They had established living on Hawaii at that time, and they had built, mostly Kat, is my understanding, had built what's called Botanical Dimensions, which is an ethnobotanical garden or farm where they're collecting all kinds of plants of ethnobotanical importance. So there's ayahuasca vines there, but the tura and all these other things that are collected on this acreage on the Big Island of Hawaii. It's still there, it's still running. You can still donate money to it. But he breaks away from that, and he's living in Hawaii by himself after 1992. His two big books, Food of the Gods, which is mushrooms, and The Archaic Revival, come out in 1992, which are his two biggest publications. They came out in reputable publishers. I think Food of the Gods may have even been on the New York Times bestseller list temporarily, and if not, it sold fairly well. And yet he's in the midst of this crisis about whether this whole mushroom thing is he, and he doesn't ever say this, but I start to imagine it's like, when he goes out and gives these talks, does he feel like he's lying? Does he feel like he's misrepresenting something? What is the emotional reality for him? And apparently he does start to suffer some depression because of this.
Have we slid into the realm of the grift?
Right. And I don't know. I'm not saying it was necessarily.
I'm talking about us. I'm not talking about Terence.
No, Kevin, we slid into the realm of grift months ago.
Right.
Episode 4, I think.
Right. Indeed. No, that is troubling, of course, right. Because he's like a priest who doesn't maybe have faith. He's sort of lost. A priest who doesn't take communion. Right. Somehow.
Right. Yeah, he doesn't actually believe, like he can't, God doesn't hear his prayers anymore or whatever, right? Now, here's the thing. What he still has is the time wave. the time wave is Terrence's idea and he came up with it, and it's interesting and it's got its followers and all those things. But in 1996, someone comes along, a young mathematician named Watkins, with the Watkins objection. Now, Pineal, I don't know if you've got anything on the Watkins objection to the time wave.
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Watkins
I've been
is like,
rampaging. I'm all keyed up. I'm summoning teachings from the something, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, it was this guy named, I think his name was Matthew. He was just like a 20-year-old guy who came along and noticed that some data from the I Ching was changed to fit with certain historical events. He noticed like I don't know if I have an exact, but yeah, he was the one also saying how, humans determining what counts as novelty and what doesn't skews everything.
Right.
He sorry, my voice.
Right.
He was talking about it about 10 years ago online. I just probably on his own website. I don't know where.
Oh, Watkins was?
Yeah, he was saying that so Terence was the one that came up with the phrase Watkins objections, right? So it just ruins ideas. Terence then hired or found a physicist who would review his original theory and Matt's objections. He quoted it as then put together in an incredibly dense and unnecessarily complicated document, including a vector analysis, and they came up with the time wave 2.0. And the physicist's name was John Sheliak. So after they crunched it and this John guy sides with Terence, he comes up, it's called the Sheliak clarification. So it goes from the Watkins objections to the clarification.
I like this. The Terence calling it the Watkins objection. It's like him calling them going down to La Chorrera. He calling it the experiment at La Chorrera. He's good at self-mythologizing, right? It's like simply by somebody has an objection to an idea you have, simply by putting it in book title caps, the Watkins objection, it somehow validates your original idea, right? It's like he's like playing in this thing where like, oh well, yes, there are objections come through, and we refute the objections, and there's the Sheliak.
Kind of LARPing is a kind of academic that maybe he's not, but he has PhDs and things. So
it's again, I don't think it's. And this is why I wanted to talk about this now. So Terence is coming. This is the way that I see it, and this is me having poured over his life and a lot of the things he said. 1988, he has this 1988, 89, he has this existential crisis related to having a rough mushroom experience. Yet he's the Johnny Appleseed of mushrooms, right? And he's built his career on that. He has this following, and I think there may have been this sense of like, but if the time wave is right, then it's okay. I'm still legitimate. If the time wave is right, then I can hang my respect for myself on that I had this, at least I had this thing. So then the objection comes along in 1996. It was the first time, in my understanding, the first time that anybody had ever even looked at the math of the time wave, because everybody else was just sort of like bowled over by the technicalities of it. It was like, whoa, man, that's wild. It seems right. And then this Watkins guy actually looks at the math and is like, hey, you can't do that. Like, you got all kinds of craziness in here that doesn't quite work.
This is just gibberish.
Right. And so the thing starts to kind of fall apart a little bit, right? But that's what Terence was hanging his hat on as being his last thing, right? He doesn't have faith in the mushrooms anymore. They turned on him anyway. His books are, maybe his books, he still believes in some of the things he said in his books, but now it's like, okay, well, now what? So this is where I see Terence being around 1996. Now, some things happen after this. 1997, McKenna's father finally dies, and this is our darkness, so I got to tell this story. 1997, Terence's dad dies of heart failure. He'd had a heart defect as a child, And remember, Terence missed missed his mother's death, right? He's been a fugitive, international fugitive or whatever, and he missed his mother's death. His father dies in Colorado, and Terence flies out there. His father had a heart defect and had an automatic defibrillator installed in his heart. So anytime he died, it would shock him back to life, right? It's just like the clear things, but it's permanently installed inside of you. The problem was this was fairly, somewhat early days for this tech. And he dies. His heart stops. Terence's dad's heart stops, and the defibrillator shocks him back to life. And then his heart stops again. It shocks him back to life. And then his heart stops again. It shocks him back to life. And this is happening rapidly over a short period of time. This automatic defibrillator is bringing him back to life, bringing him back to life. Terence shows up at the hospital. He's like, "Can somebody please shut this thing off?" Like they continually resurrecting his dad, who will live for a minute or two and then die again, right? It's happening dozens of times. And you can imagine how just horrifying this is. You go to the hospital and nobody will shut it off. And they're like, well, the doctor has to shut it off. And the doctor's off on some golf junket and they can't get a hold of him because it's pre-cell phone era. And
Whoa.
just like insanity, right? So finally, they do get it shut off. Terence leaves. Dennis shows up at the hospital like as Terence is going to the airport. They hadn't seen each other apparently in a couple of years, supposedly. And it's just the sad kind of moment in 1997 where, like, instead of having this moment where like Terence and Dennis could have been back together, they had a couple of rough patches, though they were still brothers, they still loved each other, but there'd been some stuff especially following the divorce. And I think Dennis was possibly somewhat reticent about being too close to Dennis during this period because he saw the same thing that Terence saw, which was following this 1988-89 thing. Who is Terence? Is he legit? Is he a fraud? What does he mean anymore? What is this time wave stuff? You got Dennis, who's a hardcore scientist, and his brother is like, is he some kind of cult leader now? Like, what is going on here? This could have been this moment where they kind of had a reunion at their father's deathbed and maybe made some peace, and it unfortunately wouldn't happen then. So some more time goes on. Terence is living full-time in Hawaii. It's funny, there's one interview he calls Art Bell, and Art Bell is like, "Terence, how are you talking to us right now from the middle of nowhere in Kona, Hawaii?" And Terence goes in very excited detail about how he's got this like radio relay setup that's sending his phone signal via radio over a 1 megabyte per second connection to some relay that's elsewhere on the island that then hooks up to the phone system. He's very excited about this like high tech.
Yeah, right. That's very McKenna.
Right. And Art Bell's just like, "That's unbelievable, Terence. I can't believe that you're," it's like from 1997 or something. It's very charming in a way. But anyway, so time goes on. Now 1999 comes along, and Terence, who'd always had migraines, collapses. He's got a seizure and he collapses. Some further time will go by and he would eventually be diagnosed with glioblastoma multiforme, which is a highly aggressive form of brain cancer. This is 1999. He's 53 years old. He undergoes a variety of traditional and experimental treatments. He doesn't do like the Steve Jobs thing where he's just like, well, I'm going to go off into the jungle, He's like, let's do, they got the gamma knife treatment. Let's try that. And they cut out part of the tumor and they think he's good for a while, but it ends up not being the case. And over a period of time, Terence finally succumbs to this thing. It's a kind of brain cancer. I think even now it has like a 5% survivability rate or something. It's very aggressive. Terence was concerned when he was first diagnosed that it might have been because he literally asked the doctor, like, "Hey, doc, like I have smoked weed basically every day, all day for 35 years. Do you think that has anything to do with this?" And they sort of said, "No, we really don't think it does." But you can imagine that fear, like, oh my God, did I like give myself brain cancer? Like, that's kind of a scary thought to have, right? This thing that had given you a superpower that who you relied on for your entire career had been the thing that, gave you brain cancer. Now, there's another interesting thing here. Well, there's a couple. The doctor, who doesn't really know who Terence is, he's just the guy treating Terence. The doctor starts to explain to Terence how the brain cancer. He basically says, Terence, what do you want to think of as like a mushroom? Like, do you know anything about mycelial networks and how they run? So basically what this tumor is like, it's like a mushroom that has grown in your head and it's sending mycelial fibers out into the rest of your brain. Now, okay, that's interesting and blew Terence's mind, but I want you to think about what the time wave represented. And I want you to think about a couple of the things that were notable in Terence's understanding and development of the time wave. We go back to La Chirera. He and his brother have a mutual hallucination seeing a mushroom as the planet Earth, in which they observe, or they come to understand that there's some kind of pun in history where a mushroom cloud, which looks like the mushroom that is expanding their minds to gain teachings from the cosmos, also is the thing that stands at the end of the world as a strange attractor, thereby fitting on the time wave graph, is a peak. The mushroom cloud is a peak on the time wave, right? The mushroom that they see and experience at La Chirera is another little peak. And then the mushroom in Terence's actual head that's killing him, which represents the end of Terence McKenna universe, right? It's all in there. Anyway, Terence gets quite ill. At one point, Dennis comes to him and says, hey, let's go. I want to go and have an ayahuasca ceremony with you, I think, or maybe it was even a mushroom ceremony with him. Terence is like, doesn't even really want to do it. He's like, what are we even, I'm on the way out. Like, what's the point of all of this, right? Does it anyway. And nothing happens, of course. And then his final days, apparently one of the last things that Dennis, conversations that Dennis had with him, he's very sick, falling kind of in and out of consciousness. And Terence tells Dennis, he says to Dennis, I'm having hallucinations. And Dennis says, like psychedelic hallucinations? And Terence says, what are psychedelic hallucinations? Which I think is great, because that's what his whole career was. His whole career was, I had hallucinations. What the hell are these? What is this? Right? That's been his whole career, has been trying to answer that question. And like one of the last things he says is a reformulation of that very same question. Right. And so that's it. He dies in April of the year 2000, well before his 2012 prediction of when, quote unquote, the world's going to end, history is going to end, the world is going to disappear up its own cavity.
Which day in April?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't actually have that in front of me.
I just want to know if he made it to the tax day in the new millennium. Or Hitler's birthday, which is also Earth Day.
I think
and
April 3rd. April 3rd. Oh, no, he did not.
He escaped.
He missed it. Yeah,
nice.
yeah.
Well done. Yeah, if you're going to go out before April 15th.
Yeah. Now, let me give you one thing. So there's a couple of legacy things.
Okay. All right.
And Pineal, like anything you've got to say, I know I've kind of run roughshod over all of this. So anything you want to add about the life of Terence McKenna? One thing is his books. He had a crazy library, 3,000 books. Now he'd had an earlier library that had burned. I didn't mention that, but when he was like 20, he had a library that burned. But in the ensuing years, he had a library of something around 3,000 books. And this wasn't just a grab bag of whatever. He had esoteric and occult books, books on ethnobotany. I imagine a fascinating library. This was supposed to be left to his children, to Finn and Clea, is my understanding. And then at some point, somebody from Esalen got involved and got a change made to his will. And Dennis is very suspicious of this because he thinks that at the time this change happened, that Terence was not capable of making such a decision, right? So according to Dennis, something was changed in his will that sent all of his books to Esalen. Okay, what's the big deal with that? Well, Esalen puts them in storage, and then in 2003, the building that they're in burns down and all of Terence's Terence's library is lost entirely. All 3,000 books go up in a puff of smoke, which to me is like a mini Library of Alexandria burning kind of thing, right? You know, a carefully cultivated book collection by one of the most eccentric intellectuals of the 20th century, you know, goes up, is gone.
A dip in novelty.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, literally a dip in novelty. Again, that's where I think it's like the time. There's a part of me that wants to think like the time wave is actually Terence figuring out his own life, and he thought he was figuring out the timeline of history, but in fact he was actually understanding like his own destiny or something, if that makes sense. He'd figured out the pattern of Terence McKenna's life in a way, or something like that anyway, or was looking for it if he hadn't figured it out. Yeah, I mean that's kind of all I got. Now, maybe I can read one little bit from him. This is not as long as some of them that I've read. I didn't want to leave. He's got such an interesting style. There's a thing is like, I didn't want to not read anything from him, but then I also feel like, man, other people, like you should listen to him say it because it's way better than me saying it. But let me give you something, because he talked mostly about like intellectual or quasi-intellectual concepts, but he could be quite rousing as well. Like he could be inspiring in a way. And so let me like give you a taste of that. This is from Terence. We have to create culture. Don't watch TV. Don't read magazines. Don't even listen to NPR. Create your own roadshow. The nexus of space and time where you are now is the most immediate sector of your universe. And if you're worrying about Michael Jackson or Bill Clinton or somebody else, this is the 90s, then you are disempowered. You're giving it all away to icons which are maintained by an electronic media so that you want to dress like X or have lips like Y. This is shit-brained, this kind of thinking. That is all cultural diversion. And what is real is you and your friends and your associations, your highs, your orgasms, your hopes, your plans, your fears. And we are told, no, we're unimportant. We're peripheral. Get a degree, they say. Get a job. Get a this. Get a that. And then you're a player. You don't want to even play in that game. You want to reclaim your mind and get it out of the hands of the cultural engineers who want to turn you into a half-baked moron, consuming all this trash that's being manufactured out of the bones of a dying world. So that's like a Terence McKenna message that I think we can rally behind a little bit.
One of us.
Right. So you might disagree on, you know, this idea or that idea, but ultimately, for me anyway, I end up on Terence McKenna, Team McKenna, because of things like that he said at the very least.
I'm playing third base for the Machine Elves, the AAA team for the Holy Mushroom. Yeah, baby. Yeah. Hey, Brad, Pineal, fabulous. I love it. We're going to do more. Yes, I want to hear a little more from Pineal on the After Dark episode, which is for Patreon subscribers only. I'm going to insist we go a full 30 minutes on that.
Okay.
If you appreciate what we do kindly ask for your support. The best way to do it is through Patreon. We do have some other donation options if you go to the website, but Patreon's cool. I personally message everybody who signs up there. We love to hear from people, whether or not you're on Patreon or not. But if you're on Patreon, I'll probably give you a little extra special attention. You know how it is, right? But you can always harass Brad on the Twitter account, which is at Art of Dark Pod. This is very exciting because there were some strange synchronicities between Terence McKenna and Francis Bacon, who we're going to do in a couple of hours and release today as well. All of these core episodes are evergreen. Why? Because we only do dead artists.
Right.
And we do try to be fairly comprehensive. It's good. I feel like I have a better understanding of Terence, and also, Brad, his tragic nature. There's
yes, there really is. There really is. And yes, there is. I love the guy, man. And like a lot of our subjects, but there is a certain tragic, and I guess the point is there maybe is a little bit of that in everybody's life.
Did he? And excuse me if you mentioned this. Did he remarry? Because he went on the outs, and then
he did not. No, he was in a relationship when he got sick with a younger woman. There's a little bit of controversy around that too that we didn't quite get into. But yeah, he was in another relationship after Kat, for sure.
Well, and strongly encourage you, if you're interested in McKenna and you're the kind of person who, I don't know, listens to 3-hour-long podcasts, if you're not familiar with his speaking, I would really encourage you to do that, but only after you listen to the entire Art of Darkness back catalog, which is now more than 50 episodes. Very, very fun. And Pineal, again, you're on the Bird website, right? At Pineal Colada?
I'm still hanging on there.
Still hanging on. Yep, I see you sometimes. I just want to make sure that I got it right. So it's at Pineal Colada.
And you got to check out. You got to go to her Etsy, right? Where I think if you just go, it's linked in her Twitter bio. So definitely go there. Show some support. She's making really cool stuff, really unique stuff, playing in the realms of psychedelia and shamanism and all of that.
Terence McKenna art using an image of it, and some sort of McKenna institution came for me.
No!
They wanted to like take it down?
Many years ago, yeah, I had to.
Wow.
Okay. Well,
McKenna Inc. Yeah. They show up in suits and briefcases and they look at you very sternly. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, Brad, of course, when we're going to do Timmy Leary at some point here, there's no end to the subjects we're going to cover. We've got some really fun episodes coming up. I know we're going to be doing Norm Macdonald soon. Who else are we? We've got Crowley coming up. Mr. Crowley.
Yes. John Kennedy Toole. It's coming up in a couple of weeks. So yeah. Great
guests, good people. We love doing it. We love our supporters. We love our listeners. We're trending. We're charting. I think we're 59 right now in the books category in Canada. The Leafs love us. We got to have a Scandinavian on the show right now. So
Scandinavian.
Wonderful. Yeah, we're huge in Canada. And it's good. It's good.
No, it's great. That's awesome.
And tell me, and what are we going to talk about on the After Dark, Brad? One final tease.
We are going to discuss the question and possibly surmise an answer of whether or not Terence McKenna was an asset of intelligence that is somehow involved with the FBI, somehow involved with the CIA, or some other 3-letter agency. I think it'll be interesting.
Cool. Yeah. I'm going to stick around for that.
You should. You better be here.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much. We'll see you a little bit
later.